mics are live.
Here. Director Harris has not joined just yet. Director Rankin? Here. Director Rivera-Smith?
Present.
Director Sarju?
Present.
Director Song-Moritz?
Present.
President Hersey?
Here.
And I do not yet see Director Harris online.
I will make sure to notify the public when she arrives. I would like to welcome School Board student member Luna Crom-Beron to tonight's meeting. During these meetings, we will be addressing the student members as directors. Thank you for joining us, Director Crom-Beron. I will now turn it over to Superintendent Jones for his comments, including a proclamation for Indigenous Peoples Day and a summative data review. Superintendent Jones.
Thank you, President Hersey and board members. As we acknowledge at the opening of our meetings here in Seattle Public Schools, we work and live on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. With gratitude and respect, we recommit to centering the sovereignty and voices of Indigenous communities in our work. In honor of Indigenous People Day on October 10th, we offer a proclamation. Director Crom-Beron will read the proclamation, please.
A proclamation of Seattle School District Number 1, King County, Seattle, Washington, reaffirming the district's commitment to promote the well-being and growth of every district student, especially of Seattle's American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Indigenous students. Whereas the Seattle Public Schools recognizes that the Indigenous peoples of the land that would later become known as the Americas have occupied these lands since time immemorial. And whereas the Seattle Public Schools recognizes the fact that Seattle is built upon the homelands and villages of the Coast Salish peoples of this region, without whom the building of the city would not have been possible, and whereas the Seattle Public Schools values the many contributions made to our community through Indigenous peoples' knowledge, labor, technology, science, philosophy, arts, and the deep cultural contribution that has substantially shaped the charter of the City of Seattle. And whereas the Seattle Public Schools has a responsibility to oppose the systemic racism towards Indigenous people in the United States, which perpetuates high rates of poverty and income inequality, exacerbating disproportionate health, education, and social crises. And whereas the Seattle Public Schools seeks to combat prejudice and eliminate discrimination stemming from colonization and to promote awareness, understanding, and good relations among Indigenous peoples and all other segments of our district. And whereas the Seattle Public Schools promotes educational excellence for Indigenous peoples through policies and practices that reflect the experience of Indigenous peoples, ensure greater access and opportunity, and honor our nation's Indigenous roots, history, and contributions. And whereas SB 5433 requires the teaching of the history, government, and contemporary issues of the 29 federally recognized tribes of Washington State, and whereas the school board of directors has mandated through policy number 2336 required observances to observe the second Monday of October as Indigenous Peoples Day. Therefore, all schools are encouraged to support the well-being and growth of American Indian, Alaskan Native, and Indigenous students and recognize the contributions of Native peoples on October 11th, Indigenous Peoples Day. On October 10th, 2022, is hereby proclaimed as Indigenous Peoples Day and celebrated across Seattle Public Schools.
Oh.
All right, thank you so much. We will transition to talking about academic progress. The school board adopted a progress monitoring calendar this summer that begins with looking at student outcomes from the 21-22 school year. My team will present results from the Smarter Balanced assessment that students took in the spring. They will give us some baseline data we can use to track our progress of third grade reading and seventh grade math goals. It will show us how the whole system is functioning in terms of achieving our outcomes for students. This summative data review allows us to become more familiar with the data before we begin our formal progress monitoring in December. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Keisha Scarlett, Assistant Superintendent of Academics. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Dr. Keisha Scarlett, Assistant Superintendent of Academics. Thank you so much for this great opportunity to provide an update to our board of directors with our Smarter Balanced data from spring 2022. Our hope is that it gives you information to support both your individual and public engagement and to help build readiness for our regular progress monitoring work through student outcomes focused governance process. So this short presentation is intentionally shared at a high level and will be presented by me rather than Superintendent Jones this time. Consider me as the appetizer and that he'll be the full meal in the upcoming progress monitoring session within that. And also see this as an opportunity to jot down some questions to give us sufficient time to really respond to the questions that you may have. And we look forward to hearing from the ad hoc committee's recommendations on the calendar as far as progress monitoring as it comes up. So we'll move to slide 2. So before we look at the data, I want to note that we recognize that the data we are about to review is only one measure of student outcomes and that student success encompasses multiple pathways and opportunities. As the district engages in a more thoughtful assessment system and equity-focused data analysis, the SBA student achievement levels no longer live in isolation. SPS is committed to working toward embracing the usage of leading indicators and actionable data to ensure adults in our system, both educators and staff, can react in real time to provide our students the instruction and resources they need now. Earlier this month, state and national leaders provided districts and schools with guidance about how to use the spring state assessment data after a 2-year interruption due to global pandemic. When you look at this slide here, you note from Superintendent Reitdow, I won't read it all the way aloud, but speaks about how broad scale test scores, how they can influence investment and policy priorities. So looking at the scores from the Smarter Balanced assessment are designed to really indicate whether a student's on track for college level learning. There are other aspects like engagement, attendance, and grades, and classroom-based assessments that we can use to really give the real-time information about what's happening for students as it unfolds. So we'll move to the next slide. So just to reorient you and remind you of work that we've done before as we've oriented you around this portfolio of measures and how we are invested in a portfolio of measures. So when you look at this portfolio of measures, you can see along the left side that we have different measures there with some examples, the purpose for that, and then what they can be used for. So that is just a rehashing of that. If you move to the next slide, we have the actual example of the third grade reading goal assessment portfolio, where you can see the indicator of the literacy skills, perception indicators, and enrollment. So it gives an opportunity to see how we're using
Dr. Scarlett, I just want board members to know this is in the superintendent comments if you click on that on the agenda.
Okay, all right.
So
thank you.
let's go back one
Okay,
slide
yeah,
and,
absolutely.
and give them a chance to catch up.
Okay, great. And it
Good.
remind me to take off my glasses so I can read the screen. Okay, so,
So let's just this 1 minute pause.
okay, absolutely. Thank you, Superintendent Jones. Superintendent Jones is modeling good teaching and learning practice right now, making sure that everyone has the materials.
Dr. Scarlett, I don't want to throw you off, but
Oh,
if
no
you would make the
problem.
comment now about how this is one measure of multiple measures, then they can see it in context. I
Yeah.
think that's really important.
Absolutely. So the SBA assessment data is one measure of student achievement, and this portfolio measures gives an opportunity for us to think about how we're looking at a number of different measures. So you see at the top of the chart, it has standardized summative assessments. So you can see where the SBA lies in this portfolio measures, but also combining that and triangulating, we say, with standardized interim measurements, having formative diagnostic benchmarks and assessments, formative curriculum embedded assessments, also our perceptual measures like our climate data, which we'll talk about a little bit today, and then other data like course enrollment and passage rate as well that are aligned to our strategic plan goals. Thank you. And so the next slide shows just the example of third grade and our portfolio measures that we have for our reading goal assessment portfolio. That you can see we have indicator types that both shares our literacy skills, our perception indicators, and also enrollment that we're tracking through that. Thank you. So let's go ahead and dig in and get started in this for looking at slide 5 and 6. So in this first view of student achievement, we're looking at the percentage of students in grades 3 through 8 and also grade 10 who've received a level 3 and level 4. Level 3 is considered proficient, level 4 is above proficient. English language arts or literacy student achievement is represented in the green color. Mathematics student achievement is represented by the color blue. You'll notice that certain grade bands within the achievement levels highlighting African American males' outcomes have a red star above it. This data is connected to strategic goals. That red star denotes that. So third grade literacy, 7th grade mathematics as a benchmark area, and also at 10th grade. For our student outcomes focused governance progress monitoring memos, we've shared a disaggregation of African American male students based on multilingual students, African American male students with IEPs and other categories. We plan to share this breakdown. Since you probably have questions about the N size, I want to provide one illustrative example. So for instance, in terms of the N size, we should note that, for example, at the third grade, there are 4,020 total third graders in Seattle Public Schools. 1,640 of those total third graders are students of color, furthest from educational justice, and that's also denoted down at the bottom. The asterisk at the bottom elaborates on what that means around students of color, furthest from educational justice. And of that, 467 students are our third grade students are African American male students. So our students are multidimensional, and we'll attempt to continue to share data and measures that are disaggregated so that we can really show the complexities and the multiple identities of our students. Please move on to slide 7. Thank you. So in this second view of student achievement, we're looking at the same data set as the first view, but it's just a different layout. This slide shows two distinct graphs disaggregated by English language arts and literacy and mathematics. Each graph shows grades 3 through 8 and 10th grade who are also at level 3 and level 4. All student achievement is represented by the color gray. Students of color furthest from educational justice are represented by the color blue. African American males are represented by the color green. If you move to the next slide, you're able to see how we further shared that multilingual learners are the color yellow, and then special education or IEP services are denoted by the color red. Also noting that that star refers to strategic initiative areas or strategic plan goals. We'll move to the next slide. Now we're very aware of the effect of COVID-19 and this data really shows our results before the pandemic compared to now. While there are differences in the assessments, we therefore need to be cautious of drawing too many sweeping conclusions when we look at this data as trend data. We're going to look at student achievement data from 2019 on this slide in 2022. As you know, 2 of our strategic goals are focused on English language arts and literacy at grade 3 and mathematics at grade 7. For each of these respective content goals is African American male achievement to be at 70% by 2024 for English language arts and 70% in 2026 for mathematics. Now, if you notice, each graph shows grades 3 through 8 and grades 10 who are levels 3 and 4. Students in grades 3 through 8 are represented by the solid lines. Students in grades 10 are represented by broken lines. The first row represents 2022 student outcomes and the number of students who had level 3 and level 4 achievement levels. The second row represents 2019 student outcomes and the number of students who had level 3 and level 4 achievement levels. Lastly, these tables showcase African American male students that have been highlighted in grade bands that are part of our strategic goals. You can move to the next slide. And that's where you can see the yellow color for multilingual students and also red for students served with IEPs. Next slide. So before we move into the next segment of data, I want to contextualize just the previous data. Now, at the same time, we note that State Superintendent Reichdell had an interesting perspective on this data as he began to review the fall 2021 SBA data and noted this on September 9th, that these data are encouraging. There is no question that COVID-19 significantly impacted the learning environment. Disruptions of remote learning, quarantine, and isolation, and transitioning back in person after periods of learning remotely are evident in the decrease in proficiency from spring 2019 to spring 2022. However, the incredible work of our educators and families to support students is evident in the recovery we are seeing across grade levels and subjects. Seattle Public Schools is being studied for the outcomes that we had that have exceeded even the state outcomes. As we move to the next slide, and as I shared earlier, now this is just a preview of an abundance of data for you all, and it will take us time to really unpack this and to be able to provide the level of detail. So as you look at this data here, if you're more curious about some more of the incisors, please note that this data shows the data from spring 2022 for all students of color furthest from educational justice, and also you can see African American males, and it's highlighted at those investment areas. There were red stars before, we highlighted it yellow within these tables, and then you're able to look at the comparison for spring 2019 across all students of color furthest from educational justice, and African American male students. Next slide. Again, the data shared with multilingual consistent as yellow, and then also students receiving IEP supports notice the same data that we have there. Thank you. We'll move to student climate. All right, so student climate survey data. As my staff and I were preparing for this presentation, we felt it very important not just to showcase SBA outcomes from spring 2022, we also wanted to highlight our students and their thoughts about belonging, school, and impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their development as individuals. We must also remember that behind every number is a student with goals and hopes and dreams. And I believe the best way to showcase their stories is to highlight outcomes from our climate survey at this point. This survey is administered twice a year and is created and managed by our research and evaluation team. So the last two slides give all of the all of the survey items, so if you wanted to see what they all are, but I'll just highlight a few ones that are salient, I think, for illustrative purposes. So in this next slide, oh, sorry, excuse me, I got off script a little bit. If you go to the previous slide, my apologies. You can see in this slide that we have a 25-item survey that is translated in the district's top 5 home languages, Spanish, Somali, Simplified Chinese, Vietnamese, and Amharic. And it really leans toward our core commitments around targeted universalism. I shared before that it's administered 2 times during the year. The survey covers topics on sense of belonging, safety and identity, culturally responsive teaching, relationships, social-emotional learning, student voice, and leadership. But as we move to the next slide and think about this and compare it to our new academic goals, we also added survey topics across these 4 areas: college and career readiness, math, literacy, and then also the impacts of COVID. Next slide. So in this first slide, we asked the students a question, or the query was, I feel like people accept me for who I am as a person. Now, the reason why we start with this data point is because of the central role of identity, and the affirmation of identity is closely connected to achievement. There's a close connection between a person's personal identity and their academic identity as well. So this is just one example of a question related to identity to get a clear sense of how identity matters and how we need to really look at it across questions and different metrics we use. In addition, I should note that we've been refining the climate survey questions to align more closely with our strategic plan goals. And I know that Director Harris always asks, if we're changing the survey every year, then how do we compare it? But there are refinements that we're trying to move forward with within this as we get really connected to our strategic plan goals. I read your mind, Director Harris. Okay. So in the next slide, we ask the question, my teacher has high expectations of me. So you can see how that data is disaggregated across with the different color references around that. Again, identity in culturally responsive teaching. Identity is co-created between a student, their educator team, their teachers, and their family. And so that identity, and it being a form of identity development as part of culturally responsive teaching, do my teachers have high expectations of me? And you can see the data from that. The next slide, slide 20. In these next 2 slides, we're going to look at student responses with correlations to our strategic goals for reading and mathematics. So the first slide reads, I expect to do fairly well in the math class I take. So what are those expectations around mathematics identity, in particular in this one, about my expectations for myself? This connects to the critical point about how identity connects to math achievement. And then in the next slide, we have 2 questions that we highlight. One is, I enjoy reading, and when I'm reading by myself, I understand almost everything I read. This is about the joy of reading as well as comprehension. This data could be used to guide our system and our individual educators on what support students need. For example, we've just started learning improvement networks around 3rd grade reading goal, and we'll be looking at this data with educators across schools. So how do we look at practices in small ways, but then think about how do we scale them across the entire system? So the final survey slide data highlights the impact of the pandemic on students' social emotional health and learning. So the questions that are asked on this is, over the past year, how much of an impact did COVID have on your social emotional well-being, and then over the past year, how much of an impact did COVID have on your learning. And so we will continue to look at this data in a coordinated way as we improve our support systems for students in service of educators, students, and their families as well. So as I shared, the last 2 data slides are of the survey items, if you just want to be refreshed on what those survey items look like before. And so in summary, I know we reviewed a whole lot of data, and it will take some time for us to really unpack the information that was presented tonight. To return to an earlier point, I hope that this presentation provides a thoughtful segue into our student outcomes focused governance updates and the work ahead. And we know that Superintendent Jones will do a great job of sharing that information as we move into progress monitoring. So we want you to give you this information so that you can share your questions ahead of time, and we can really take full advantage of our next upcoming sessions. So if there are any questions, thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Scarlett. Do you have something you'd like to share?
No, I was gonna see if we had 5 to 10 minutes for questions, and then we'll set it up later for work session, perhaps after you all digest this. But this is really a snapshot of where we are. Please.
Yes, absolutely. And I was just going to say, as we open for director questions, I would like to ask directors to focus on clarifying questions regarding the data. Like we just mentioned, we'll have an opportunity to have a deeper conversation with Dr. Jones on strategy and the progress monitoring sessions this winter. Today is obviously just a brief opportunity for directors to engage with student outcome data and get a sense of where we are and where we were, rather, at the end of the 21-22 school year. So with that in mind, Director Harris, take it away.
Thank you. You mentioned students receiving special education services with an IEP. Are 504 plan students included? Students that have a 504 plan included under the orange
area? You know what? I did not ask that question. It's a really great question, so I'll follow it with my staff. My representation of this when I read it was with students with IEPs, so we do need to follow up with 504s, and I'll make sure I follow up with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Director Rivera-Smith.
Thank you. And thank you for all these wonderful, colorful graphs we have here. My question is, what is the participation? Do we have participation by all students in these, or do we know what the opt-out rate is, or how many we might be missing?
Are you speaking about the surveys?
Yes.
Let's see, I heard this data yesterday. I believe that our previous participation rate, because, before COVID, was around 70 something percent, 75% or so. The participation rate did drop down into the low 60s. Maybe 61% participation, so there were some different barriers, last year, but we would expect it to move to pre-pandemic rates and even higher, hopefully, as people see more and more value in the data as well. So yes, there was a drop during pandemic participation.
Do we know if the participation, what their drop rate was by demographic?
I will follow up with my team on that to see if there's a demographic breakdown that could be shared about that. That's a great question.
Thank you.
I'll make a note about that.
And last question is regarding, I see that the climate survey was translated to the top 5 languages, but we have many more than that in our district. So students who are not in those top 5, how were they able to take, did they have accommodations to take the survey?
Yeah, I'm not absolutely sure about those accommodations. I do know about those languages that I shared there, and about, of course, our English version of the surveys as well.
All right, thank you.
So that might be an impact on participation, but we can follow up, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Director Song Moritz.
Thank you. I have 2 observations, and I'm hoping that we will have opportunity at a later point to do a deeper dive. I'm looking at the student climate survey. My teachers have high expectations of me, and there's a real drop-off between elementary school and middle school, and I'm sure that's probably just because there are a lot more teachers, but I would like to have a better understanding of what is the sentiment behind our middle school and high school students behind that. And then the next question in this climate survey, I expect to do fairly well in any math class I take. I think I was personally kind of surprised by the relative confidence of our students compared to looking at the performance on the standardized test scores. And so I just have a general wondering about that. Thank you.
Go ahead, Director Hampson.
First of all, thank you for this excellent preview, and I'm just super excited to be talking about student data because it's been a while, and I think that, you know, coming onto the school board, that's what I thought we were going to be doing, and it feels like it's been quite some time since we've had data. COVID was a big part of that, and so, and this is just a fantastic preview. And in part because it does bring up so many excellent questions. And not to say that my question's going to be excellent, but my fellow directors' questions have been excellent. I was noticing on the percent of students meeting standard on the Smarter Balance assessment, let's see, what's probably better, I don't know what slide this is. The blue graph, percent of students meeting standard levels 3 and 4, percent of students meeting standard, that was on, no, what is the difference between these two?
The one that has the red stars on it, does it have the red stars on it?
No, it's the actual graphs, the line graphs from 2018,
Oh, okay.
19 to 2022. Oh, I think
Yeah.
one is
Slide 9, I believe. Yeah.
okay. So what I notice is that on the next slide, so go to 10, yeah, that there's not much, there's less of a drop among multilingual special education learners in particular. That's true to some, that's also true on math. In the prior slide for African American males, and my question about this is, and possibly to be answered at a later time, is the lack of additional drop just simply that the bar was already so low, right? We were already underperforming to such an extent that it didn't get appreciably worse because we were doing so poorly, and what that tells us, right? That even during COVID, we didn't have as much of a drop, whereas we had, you know, a much more significant drop overall with all students.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, these are different tests and different students. And so while it looks like a drop, this is almost hard to make this comparison because
Apples and oranges.
we're apples and
okay.
screwdrivers almost.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I mean, yeah, so, I mean, the question is just, what do we learn about how our students for some educational justice and African American males performed during COVID relative to other, to the broader group, and if there really isn't anything, then what are we meant to glean from this particular set of data points?
Yeah, it's just an opportunity to look at, even though the assessments, you know, we say we're different assessments, it's an opportunity to look at, with soft eyes, you know, a trend of data, but also like the recovery. Mm-hmm. So 2022 data becomes our like new baseline by which we can compare, you know, over other years, but we're not comparing, of course, the same students. It's always a different group of students, but to just think about, okay, what is it overall, just like us using SB as our top line measure, we're looking at sort of the overall of what's happening for our students, but understanding that any of this data is being looked at through that portfolio measures of other, you know, data that is more predictive, that can help us, that'll be part of the progress monitoring.
And then the other question I had, thank you for that, was about the extent to which we exceeded other parts of the state in terms of, and what were those kind of general areas where we outperformed, or is that Or
Yeah, I don't really have that,
Okay.
like at that level of data, but there, were explorations, and I mean, we can maybe take a little bit of soft eyes to the Seattle Times also, right, and their feature about what's happening with test scores. But I don't have like specific data about all the different areas at this point of that. But I think it's important for us to keep exploring this data and looking at sort of the causal impacts within that, but also looking at our dynamic, more predictive data, throughout the year that will be collected as far as our progress monitoring. So this gives like a really high level, like sort of snapshot of like what does our sort of trajectory look like, over time with new baselines for 2022.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Director Rankin.
Thank you. Thank you, by the way, for all of this. For students who more than one category applies to them, so say an African American male who receives special education services, would that student be counted once in each category?
Yeah,
Okay.
so, yeah, exactly. And so we do recognize the intersectionality of our students. They could be multilingual, have IEP supports, and also, be African American male, and even multiracial. And so to that degree, that is how we're trying to like really think about how can we disaggregate the data that give sort of the full dimensions of, who our students represent and the families and communities that come from as well.
So I think that's helpful, and I think rather than going by student and counting them only once in one category, it makes sense to count them in more. But I wonder if at some point it would be useful or possible to look at the impact of intersectionality within the data. I don't know if that's something we're thinking about for going into more depth.
I would say in our inclusionary practices work, I mean, one of the things that we are all setting goals to look at targeted universalism, right? And so looking at the achievement of African American males who are served with IEPs, and like what are the programs that they're, being supported in, what does the academic achievement look like within that? So you're spot on about sort of that intersectional approach in thinking about, the work that we're doing ongoing, so absolutely.
Okay, great, yeah, but I think it is helpful to know, and helpful in this context to know, that each student is counted for the percentages of every category in which they qualify. I have a noticing that I'm not going to go too much into, but that students receiving special education services have the lowest feeling of acceptance and high expectations by their teacher, especially at that 10th grade level. That's kind of a punch in the gut, to be quite honest. The question around the COVID impact, can you help me understand what the percentages represent? So over the past year, how much of an impact did it have? And then there's percentages. So are the percentages, do the percentages represent students who reported it had a big impact?
Yeah,
or do
that
they
was one we
represent
talked
the
about.
sort of like reference of amount of impact?
Yeah, if you look at the top, I don't know if you can see it on there. I should have shared that one 'cause it
who
came up in
responded
questions.
often or always? It's
Yeah,
right
who
there.
responded
Yep,
often
thank
or
you.
always.
Thank you.
No, that was I didn't read on the document, so thank you. That was a
I
great
just went
question.
right past that. Thank
Absolutely,
you.
yeah.
Okay. And then I guess clarifying, Director Harris asked about students with 504s. So I think it's critical that however we're looking at this data, that we're being very consistent about which students we're talking about, because students with disabilities, students who qualify for IEP services, and students who have a 504 may or may not be, there are students with disabilities who don't have any of those supports. And then I think our number of students who have a 504 is actually really pretty small, not insignificant, but that's a different. So I guess I'm just saying for me, for my personal view on the academic data, I would support or I guess I'm asking, when we talk about students receiving special education services in this context, are we talking about students who qualify for an IEP? Or encompass any other of those categories. My preference would be to stay specifically to students who qualify for IEP services, because that is a federal level of qualification, and it also determines services that are provided at the district and classroom level in a more distinct way than other groups of students. I think if we are, depending on the context, if we're talking about, the overall sense of self or acceptance of a students with disabilities, that's a different question to me than looking at impact specifically for students who have an IEP. And that also goes into when you graduate, having a modified diploma or a standard diploma, that would only apply to students who have an IEP. So I just want to make sure that we're really super duper clear, and I'm kind of looking to my colleagues also for consensus or understanding that really, really clear about when we're talking about any student with any disability or a student who qualifies for services through the federal definition of the 13 categories of disability that entitle you to IEP services, or if you qualify for an accommodation based on Section 504. So I think it's super important that we're just very consistent about which students we're talking about every time we talk about that. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Director Crone-Burrell.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. And I was just wondering, well, firstly, for my fellow directors and Superintendent Jones, I do think I would really appreciate, and I believe that Nasira and Jenna would also really appreciate, if we could have a work session surrounding how we structure these climate surveys. I think specifically with this as a climate survey, when we're surveying student climate, students should be central to creating these kind of survey. If we're asking students how they feel, I think students are going to know best how to ask other students how they're feeling. And then my question was, I was looking at, on the last two slides, all the questions that are asked by topic, and for middle and high school students. And then I scrolled past that, and I see with the elementary school items, we have the questions for college and career readiness. We have the questions for math, literacy, COVID. But I was wondering, do we have the same kind of identity and culturally responsive teaching, safety, bias, and anti-racism, positive behavior and safety questions framed for younger students? Are those existent and just not included here, or are those something that aren't here at the moment?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a great question. On the slide before, it reads up at the top that the items were worded for middle and high school students, and so I'm not absolutely sure if there's another set of items that are for elementary, within this. So based upon the information I have here, I'd have to infer that what you see as the difference, in the last slide for elementary school items and middle school items is listed there, that are connected to the strategic plan goal areas. So I can check in with our team, our research and evaluation team, to find out exactly which ones were the elementary ones, and we can add that information in as well.
Yeah, I would appreciate that, just considering that, elementary school students do deserve a chance to speak up about the safety and positiveness of their learning environment just as much as middle and high school students. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Great question. I have one question of my own, and it's less of a question and more of a request. As we are looking through some of this data, especially at like a high level in the climate survey portion, I think one of the most poignant ones is the question around the drop off from, I feel as though my teachers have high expectations of me. when we are putting our narrative together and how we talk about this, I just want to make sure that our educators are included in the process of determining what does that look like, right? And why that data is what it is. I think it would be really easy for a community member to look at this with very little context, or even a district official to look at this with very little context around the perspective of the folks who are actually working with our students in classrooms on a day-to-day basis. And so I just want to make sure that that voice is captured in some way as we approach the progress monitoring, as well as how we determine what is our plan moving forward to address this and what that looks like. So if we could find a way to ensure that as much educator voice is captured in the narrative piece of that, that would be of a high priority to me.
Thank you so much. I made that note.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Scarlett. I think that concludes this portion of today's agenda. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Okay. Yay, student outcomes. Okay. I would like to again welcome our student board member, Luna Crombaron, to the meeting tonight. Director Crombaron began her junior year at the center school a few weeks ago and will be serving on the board's audit and finance committee. Our student members have had the opportunity to provide comments as we begin each meeting, and like other directors, I also welcome our student board members to ask questions as they have so eloquently done already. And input as we move through the remainder of tonight's meeting agenda. I will now turn it over to Director Crombaron for her comments.
Thank you, President Hersey, and I will keep this brief, but hello, my name is Luna Crombaron. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a junior here in our school district. I would like to recognize with my time tonight as a proud first-generation U.S. citizen of a Colombian father that we are here in this space during Hispanic Latine Heritage Month, which is recognized which is recognized from September 15th through October 15th each year. I am proud to be representing my community at a district level as we speak, and I am proud to be one of the roughly 13% of our students who are Hispanic identifying. As we recognize the rich and beautiful history of Latine cultures and peoples, it is important that we act to uproot the systemic colonial violence that Latine young people are forced to grow up with each and every day. Specifically, from an education standpoint, we must make sure our curriculums are created with a decolonized perspective and informed heavily by Indigenous folks, specifically when we are talking about history. I'm looking at you, textbooks written by racist old white men. To conclude, la Latina en mí es una brasa que arde para siempre. Muchísimas gracias. I yield my time.
Okay, before we move into public testimony today, I want to take an opportunity for our board to recognize and hear from a Seattle Public Schools parent for her advocacy. Ms. Calista Coles serves on the Seattle Public Schools Indian Parent Committee and is a parent of 4 current SPS students. After 3 long years of Ms. Cole leading and advocating for Senate Bill 5498, known as Evanston's Law, was successfully enacted earlier this year. Under Evanston's Law, Seattle Public Schools and districts across the state are now able to issue diplomas for high school students whose lives have ended while still on track to graduate. Ms. Cole, welcome. Thank you for being here today to address the school board and share your story. I invite you to do so now. The floor is yours.
Thank you. It is an honor to be here, and I wish I could say a privilege, but it's not a privilege because I shouldn't have to speak on this. I am aware that Seattle Public Schools does allow honorary diplomas for their students. However, across Washington, our school districts pick and choose which students get an honorary diploma. My son, Everton, was a Seattle Public School student from kindergarten to 9th grade. He attended Rainier View Elementary, Stevens Elementary, Aki Karosi, and Roosevelt High School. He went on to go to treatment for mental health and substance abuse because he was a student with disabilities. He was a student with an IEP. He was a student with undiagnosed mental health issues. He was also an Indigenous student. He went to go live with his father when he was 16, and he attended school in the Highline School District. He didn't stay in contact because of his mental health issues. He came home when he was about 18, and today, September 28th, 4 years ago, was the last day I saw him alive. It was the last time I heard his voice, and his words were, "I will be back." In that moment, I didn't realize what an impact him coming back would make. That he wasn't gonna come back physically, that he was gonna come back spiritually and emotionally and helping me to be stronger than ever. When he attended school in Highline, he struggled to stay in school. He was in and out of school, and his last high school credit was earned in August 2008. Upon his death, he thought he had over 5 high school credits to graduate. When I went to Highline School District, because I have heard of honorary diplomas being given to students, they said he had to have reached full high school credits before receiving an honorary diploma, and they gave me a certificate of something, and I can't even remember because I've been so focused on getting what he deserved. And they gave me his high school transcript. Upon receiving his high school transcript, I realized he had a high school missing, which meant from the 9th grade, he was missing high school credits. He was only 2.38 high school credits away from graduating, and they responded with, "That's a clerical error, and we're sorry." I know for a fact, because I'm a mother of another high school senior, she will graduate 2023, that if you ask any student who had high school credits missing from the 9th grade, if that would be acceptable as a clerical error, I guarantee you not one of them would say, "Oh yeah, that's fine, that's great." Because of this clerical error, I know that my son would have graduated, but they said, "We have no way of knowing he would have graduated," and I know that's a lie. I know for a fact because he was in his 6th year of high school. He struggled with mental health. He was in and out of school, but he wanted that graduation certificate. He wanted that. He wanted that because his mother, me, I got my GED, and his father got his GED, and he wanted a high school diploma. He wanted to be better than his parents, and that is my goal for my children in life, to be better than me, because I come from so much trauma. I come from struggling. I come from intergenerational trauma, and that is a part of the reason why I'm standing here telling parts of his story, because it is all connected. Even I was a Seattle Public School student, and in the 7th grade, I sat on the stairs early in the morning at South Shore Middle School, looking into the door, a foster child, and I decided that was my last day attending school. And I ran away from my foster home because I did not feel wanted or loved, but there were a handful of teachers along the way that loved me and cared for me, and I know that they tried really hard because they knew I was smart as a straight A student. And I know in Seattle Public Schools, there were a handful of teachers like Mia Williams who knew my son, and Ms. Gilligan Miller at Aki Karosi who knew my son. and Miss Carter, who knew my son, and they all loved him, and they all knew his spirit. When Highline School District said that they cannot give me an honorary diploma because the law says that is for those who dropped out of school or left high school. I won't say dropped out of school, but they left high school to serve in the war, that it doesn't pertain to our students now, especially our students of color who die at a higher rate of homicide and suicide. Unfortunately, those are just the facts. And that's how my son left, was homicide. And the truth behind that is he was shot by a 16-year-old who I hope graduated high school, who I hope has made a better life for himself. But that's the thing, is that he gets that chance and my son doesn't. My son, who had an IEP, who had a right to a fair education, who was failed by the state. My son, who had a right to walk with his graduating class in his graduating year, who never did. My son, who was failed by the state of Washington because they misreported his high school credits and called it a clerical error. My daughter came home at the end of the school year at Rainier Beach High School this summer and let me know that they honored a young woman who had been killed, who attended their school. And I thought that was so beautiful. But because there's law, I'm still waiting for my son's diploma. Highline School District has it. And they asked if I wanted them to send it to me, and I said no, because they need to hand it to me. I am a parent of 4 more children, a high school senior and 2 sixth graders and a 3rd grader. And this has an impact on them too. And we need to realize and understand that every child matters in life and in death, because we, the parents, the family, we're still here in community. We are the bank tellers, and we are the bus drivers, and we are the teachers, and we are the community. And how our districts treat us and hold us in that has an impact on us. Because I could have given up, and I could have created more trauma for my children, which would have created more problems for the Seattle Public School District, because they'd be in school with those problems and that trauma. Instead, like I said, my son came back and helped me to be stronger than ever, to recognize and identify that intergenerational trauma is real. And we need to address it. And on that note, I want to say Chandra Hampson has heard me talk about these things, because my daughter was in school and she was having a hard time, and staff looks at our children like, they're just starting fights. But my daughter was processing that trauma, that pain. Mr. Hersey, I've reached out to you and I've spoken with you on the phone and I've had emails with you, but I have not heard anything about how we're going to fix the trauma awareness in our schools. And it took me having to be here. It took me having to change a law to be recognized and heard. That has an impact on me. And so I changed one law, and I'm not done. This isn't it for me. It's not over, because we have children that are still here. Thank you.
I just want to acknowledge the courage that took to come here and share the stories that so many of our families experience, but never get the opportunity to actually say it to somebody that has the power to do something about it. So very moving. Let's just sit with that for a moment. Let's take 60 seconds and just let the gravity of what was just shared with us settle. Thank you, Ms. Cole, for joining us tonight and for your advocacy and much more. We will next go to public testimony. We will be taking public testimony by phone and in person as stated on the agenda. Board Procedure 1430 BP provides the rules for testimony, and I ask that speakers are respectful of these rules. I will summarize some important parts of this procedure. First, testimony will be taken today from those individuals called from our public testimony list and, if applicable, the waiting list, which are included in today's agenda posting on the school board website. Only those who are called by name should unmute their phones or step forward to the podium, and only one person should speak at a time. Speakers, does somebody else have their mic on? Okay, I'm just getting a little bit of feedback. Speakers from the list may cede their time to another person. Oh, it's the one over there. Okay, then it's fine. When listed to the speaker's name is called. The total amount of time allowed will not exceed 2 minutes for the combined number of speakers. Time will not be restarted after the new speaker begins, and the new speaker will not be called again later if they are on the testimony waiting list. Those who do not wish to have their time ceded to them may decline and retain their place on the testimony or wait list. The majority of the speaker's time should be spent on the topic they have indicated they wish to speak about. Finally, the board expects the same standard of civility for those participating in public comment as the board expects of itself. Ms. Koo will read the testimony speakers.
Thank you, President Hersey. Speakers joining us via phone, please remain muted until your name is called to provide testimony. When your name is called, please be sure you have unmuted on the device you are calling from, and also press *6 to unmute yourself on the conference call line. Each speaker will have a 2-minute speaking time. You will hear a beep when your time is exhausted, and the next speaker will be called. The first speaker on the list is Najima Abadir.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Najima Abadir, and I'm a senior at Nathan Hale. All right. Okay. My name is Najima Abadir, and I'm a senior at Nathan Hale. Being a leadership student has made me appreciate how Hale is a student-led school. At my school, I feel heard and I feel valued. And as students, we can do all kinds of things like planning events, holding student forums, and we're able to speak to our school admin. But I know that this isn't district-wide. Students should all be a part of the decision-making in every school, especially in places like our school newspapers, hiring committees, school senate, and anywhere students can make an impact in and out of the classroom. I also want to bring up students' mental health and well-being. New students don't have the same relationship with teachers and staff that they need. They need to feel protected, and every student needs to have a staff member or an adult at their school that they can trust. Coming back from the pandemic, the people who helped me feel comfortable were people who I already connected with online and during my time as a freshman. That includes my friends and staff and teachers. But as a leadership student who works with underclassmen, I don't see these connections anymore. And I know this causes students to feel less interested in school, and I even see them disrespecting teachers. And I know this isn't just a problem at my school. I think we should be the ones reaching out to them and showing them how communities work. We should make our district inviting and comfortable and give all of our students a chance to succeed. I see teachers trying, but I don't think they have enough support or resources to fully engage all of their students. I think all of this district solutions to help students' mental health are piled onto the work teachers are already doing to care for their students. I want to end with some questions. If you really want to hear your students, you need to listen. So do you actively reach out to students for opinions that don't always agree with yours? Do your students feel respected and heard? Thank you.
The next speaker on the list is Chris Jackins.
My name is Chris Jackins, Box 84063, Seattle 98124. On the Sca contract, the district has stated that it is uncertain about paying for years 2 and 3 of the contract. Was a one-year contract considered? On the Indigenous Peoples Day proclamation, the proclamation does not mention the Duwamish tribe. School Board Resolution 2016-17-1 supports treaty rights and benefits for the Duwamish tribe. On the construction projects at Alki, John Rogers, and Montlake. 4 points. Number 1, the budget transfers are $15 million for Montlake, $3 million for John Rogers, and $8.7 million for Alki. Number 2, the report states that $2 million is being saved by moving surplus soil from Montlake to John Rogers. Tying these two projects together complicates both projects. Number 3, at Montlake, the playground will shrink to half its current size. At John Rogers, it will shrink by a third. At Alki, the project is way too large for the site. Number 4, the environmental review is not yet complete on these projects. Please vote no. On the naming of the Records and Archives Center in honor of Eleanor Taves. 2 points. Number 1, recognizing a talented person who looked after the history of the district is nice. Number 2, also, please stop bulldozing important history at school site after school site. On the Madison Field project, please do not replace natural grass with artificial turf and do not have tall light poles for night field use. Thank you very much.
The next speaker on the list is Alex Zimmerman. Alex Zimmerman. The next speaker on the list is Sherilyn Crowther. Sherilyn Crowther.
Hello, I'm Cheryl Crowther, President of the Seattle Special Education Parent Teacher Student Association. And there is nothing that I can say, no testimony that I have in front of me, that can better tell the story of students with disabilities than what that breathing and powerful mother just shared. I will just say, when I have testified about the system is not broken, the system is working as designed, what she said about intergenerational trauma is part of the system. I will save the rest of my time. I would actually like 30 seconds at least to just again think about that incredibly powerful testimony. Thank you.
The next speaker on the list is Catherine George. Catherine George. Catherine, if you're on the line, please press *6 to unmute. The next speaker on the list is UT Hawkins.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. It's nice to be here. I have been, my name is UT Hawkins. I am Muskogee Creek and Kiowa Nations. I'm a mother, I'm an educator, a Seattle Public School parent now. I am also here representing and speaking as Seattle Education Association's Vice President and lead negotiator. I know that you are here today going to look and speak to the contract that was recently brought forward to this board. I wanted to speak to say that a contract is a commitment as a community. So this contract is only as quality as the commitment brought forward by both parties to ensure its actions. That begins with a lot of trust. What I know from my experience in this negotiations is that 6,000 educators stood behind every word within this contract in support of students, staff, and the communities they serve. 55,000 families stayed out of school buildings, insisting that we do the work needed and necessary, and that we insist within our contract the advocacy of their voices as well through this process, and they saw that. I wanted to speak to inclusionary practice, because one thing that I've heard repeatedly is that Seattle Public Schools and us are 44th in the nation. I want to be very clear. As a state, we are 44th in the nation. But OSPI, when you look at Seattle Public Schools, we meet with 70% of students with IEPs. They are within our classrooms in general education practice 80 to 90% of their time currently. Our dedication as educators to that work and within this contract is evident, and I want you to know there is a dedication of that work already happening and moving forward. When you look at this contract, look to the fact that special education, multilingual education, all have task force and community inclusion involvement, and that inclusionary practice goes beyond that. It goes to informed family decisions, where staff and students and educators are all involved in that process. And then there's also religious accommodations, counselors, family support workers, and social workers. You heard the community speak to all of these things as necessary. Classified staff as well are the integral parts of those supports. And I want us to understand that the dedication and improvements in our system are about holistically meeting children's needs. There's more to do to make this contract evident and to make Seattle Public Schools ready for the work of inclusion. And that is what this contract brings forward as a commitment of my educators to this work and the students and families who stood on those lines with them. My daughter was thrilled to start school. And every student that stood on those lines, every family that looked into the contract, every educator who looked into that contract saw that this is about dedication and trust within us all to do this work, because a contract is only as good as the people who actualize it in process. And that's what we need to do moving forward. That means a commitment to our classified educators who have asked specifically for investments not only in them as respect for their skills, respect for them being included in the system, and respect for them as professionals who would rather do this than go work somewhere else. So please take that readiness seriously. Know that we are prepared to respond. We need to be prepared to respond when staff and students ask for help. That students and staff are demanding involvement, and we've heard it here multiple ways in different ways and times. And that our process of collaboration is embedded in this contract. So please look for that accountability. It would be remiss of me not to take a moment right now to acknowledge that I'm a Black and Indigenous woman. I take very seriously that commitment within my work. And I wanted to bring forward and mention a continued conversation with the school board that I will need to have, and thank you for the extra time. There's been a recent change outside of this contract that will need to be a continued conversation around the civility policy. Today I'm here as an Indigenous person to speak to this, and my community as a whole will speak to it as well with you ongoing. Civility policies have roots in chattel slavery. They have roots in misogyny. And staff have now had their right to the HIB process eliminated. This needs to be a continued conversation, because there will never be a conversation that I will be able to have as a Black Indigenous person about how civil I am supposed to be. Yet now there is no way for me to have that nuanced conversation. And so we need to do more if we are committed to racial equity, not just for our students, but for the staff and people within the school district who are committed to this contract, committed to the ways we work together, and committed to that collaboration. Because right now we've stepped back from that work with the civility policy that has not have the barriers and boundaries around it to provide the support needed, because the work that we want to do is in that contract. And I hope you see it, because we are dedicated to that work. And that work is complicated, but we are here to do it, and I hope that you see that dedication and the hours and months spent sitting in the room together to get school open. Thank you so much.
The next speaker on the list is Thomas Heller. Thomas Heller. Thomas, if you're on the line, please press *6 to unmute. The next speaker on the list is Joanna Cullen. Joanna Cullen. Before we end today's testimony, I want to go back and check on those who may have missed their turn. The first is Alex Zimmerman. The next is Catherine George. And the next is Thomas Heller. And the last is Joanna Cullen. This concludes today's testimony.
Thank you, Ms. Koo. That concludes public testimony for the meeting. Thank you for comments. Before we move on, I'll note that board directors, I'm not going to say that part, sorry. We have now come to the board committee reports section of the agenda. We'll hear briefly now from the chairs of the board's committees and our legislative liaison. We will begin first with the Audit and Finance Committee, Vice President Hampson.
Sorry, can you come back to me?
No problem. You are also next for the Ad Hoc Governance Committee. Will you need time for both? Happy to cycle back.
Yes, please do.
All right. So next up is the Executive Committee, which is your boy, me. We had a riveting discussion specifically around the adoption of the 2022 School Board Director Redistricting Plan. Folks have been doing a great job of submitting various points of feedback via our online opportunities. And so if you're at home and you're watching this and you're like, what redistricting plan? Please check your email. There should be something there. And if not, feel free to email your favorite board director and we will be more than happy to get you the information that you're looking for, or even the board office staff or the Office of Public Affairs. There's so many people that you could reach out to get that information. The next thing that we discussed in committee was the discussion of our October retreat agenda. So board directors, again, here's an opportunity. If you have something that you would like to discuss at the retreat, please feel free to tell me about it so that I can make sure that we try our best to incorporate it into the agenda. And if anybody out there doesn't have anything to do on one of our beautiful Saturdays coming up in October, those meetings are public, so you could come and hang out with us if you so choose. But other than that, those were the big topics from the executive committee. Our next meetings are scheduled for October the 19th, November the 16th, and December the 7th. And there will likely be a little bit of a change in calendar, considering that many of our board directors will be attending a conference on student outcomes focused governance in Orlando, Florida, the week of October the 19th. So stay tuned. If there are changes, we will be sure to let you know. All right, moving on to our next committee, the Operations Committee, which is led by Director Vera Smith. Are you prepared at this time to give comments? Yeah. All right. So, Director Hampson, looping back, will you be beginning with audit and finance or ad hoc governance?
So there's actually three. There's finance. We also had an audit meeting, and then ad hoc. The finance meeting was on audit and finance committee meeting, as it's called, was on September 19th. And not a whole lot to report. Quarterly listing of contracts and modifications exceeding $250,000 and ramping up towards the state auditor's office contract. In case folks have forgotten, we do get audited every year by the state, and that information in prior audits is available. This is the time when they come in and prep, and we have an opportunity to talk about any concerns we have. And our next meeting for audit and finance is on October 17th. And for audit, we met on September 13th and went through an update on our implementation of the internal audit, high-functioning internal audit implementation plan, which is well underway, and as well as an ethics update, and then went through audit response. And we'll have some notable audit response items coming to the coming up when we meet again in December on the 5th. These meetings are now at 4 p.m. instead of at 8 a.m. as they once were. And one of those we'll have an update on a previous, I believe from 2019, transportation services plan. And then the other notable thing that is underway now is a internal and external communications audit that I know both board and staff are excited about seeing that move through. Again, next meeting is on December 5th. The ad hoc committee met yesterday and meets again tomorrow morning. We are quickly approaching our deadline to have all of our recommendations regarding the final implementation calendar and action items for bringing student outcomes focused governance fully online. The committee's been very hard at work, lots and lots of papers, and if anybody has really wanted to torture themselves by sitting through one of our meetings, we appreciate you. Because as I reminded Superintendent Jones today, imagine if the only time you could work was in public meetings. And that's what we do. Ugly as it may be, we have spent since June working together, doing our best to capture. We're not allowed to talk with each other about these items when we're not in that public setting. I don't think people realize that. So all the work that we do is messily done in real time during that meeting, and it's coming together. Really grateful to my fellow ad hoc committee members and the superintendent, and particularly the board office staff, who's been doing some incredible work and research. I know we terrify them every single time, but I know that we are all really interested in getting to a place of much greater efficiency and much greater focus on student outcomes. And also, at the other piece of that, and this is a component of that, is the capacity to be much more proactive in our community engagement and our community outreach as board members. So hopefully good things to come, including trainings that we'll be doing in public. To your point, Director Crone-Baron, we will be needing to, not only with our student school board members, but doing public trainings on student outcome focused governance and what it means to have public conversations, two-way conversations with our community about how our goals represent the vision of our community in terms of the outcomes that we want for students. So we have a very busy 24 hours ahead of us, and look forward to being able to have those greater discussions with the board. Thank you, Director Hersey. President Hersey.
You can call me Brandon. Okay, Director Rivera-Smith, are you prepared at this time? Take it away.
Thank you. We had our last Operations Committee meeting on September 19th. Many of the bars we saw there will be covered today in introduction, so I will not go over those now, but we also did have a transportation update from our new transportation manager, Joe Hebert, who comes to us from Community Transit in Everett. We welcome him, and he's already hard at work, as many of us have heard, and if you haven't, you would be happy to know that we are doing really good with our bus service this year as far as serving all routes, so that is a testament to the work that's been happening in that department. We also heard from our new interim Executive Director of Operations, Marnie Campbell, as long as welcomed our new Enrollment Planning and Enrollment Services Interim Director, Fao Manu. They are both with us to give us an update on the work they're doing there. And it's really just ongoing work. We don't expect to have any major boundary changes this year as far as the student assignment transition plan goes, so everybody can kind of rest a little easy knowing that there won't be any upcoming disruptions as far as those movements go in this next school year, or in really it's kind of planning for the next year, but it's still, that's work that is ongoing. So as they get into their roles and the year progresses, there will be more to come on conversations if there needs to be any regarding needed changes there. So lots have happened. We don't actually have our current October meeting scheduled yet. I think, as President Hersey mentioned, we're going to be out of town, a lot of us, for the week that they would normally be held. So we'll just keep an eye out for if and when our October is held, and if not, we will just meet again in November. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Rankin.
Thank you. Student Services Curriculum and Instruction Committee met last week, and we had, I think I flagged it for you all in email, even though, we all get all the materials, but I kind of did a special attention to my colleagues to check out the Research and Evaluation Projects presentation. There were some slides that provided some really helpful context about how they view their work, that we all found very interesting and helpful. I also, we had a special education update about some work coming through related to inclusion and culturally responsive practices and just general special education best practices that I noted, but I can't now remember what the outcome was, that it was extremely helpful update that should be coming to more people than just the committee. So one thing I will note about that too is that in response to that and in preparation for future conversations, I resent you all an email, one of the reports that we were given as part of the SPS SEA Task Force on Inclusionary Practices last year. There was a particularly comprehensive one that came to all of us, and I can't remember what month it was, but I pulled that memo out of the committee meeting packets, which you would have gotten at the time, but and sent it to you all again a few days ago. So please look back at that if you're having questions or getting questions about what work is happening, because it has been happening and continues to happen, and we have been provided with several meaningful updates throughout the course of last year, and those can be found in materials that you have. We skipped the work plan because moving into our recommendations from the ad hoc committee, that's likely going to change some things. So, and then as Director Hersey said, we're all in a conference next month, so future announcements about SSC&I is majorly TBD right now. On the legislative liaison side, this Friday is the WASDA, the Washington State School Directors Association General Assembly, where school boards from all 295 school districts in Washington State have representative votes in the General Assembly on priorities preparing for the 2023 legislative session. And so I will be representing our board and voting. It's just a simple up or down. And then I can't remember the deadline I gave you all, but I have not received responses yet about priorities. So be sure to get those to me if you have any burning things you think that you don't want me to miss, although I feel pretty solid going in about any of our previously stated priorities, and I will vote in alignment with what we have already said is important as a board. And then the next thing that happens after that will be once the votes have been compiled from General Assembly, WASDA will re-put out their legislative priorities as voted upon by membership, and then they will develop a top 10. So we will have the opportunity as a board to submit our personal top 10 issues for legislative advocacy through WASDA. And so the public will see, how we weigh in on what those are. We will be able to use that in our advocacy efforts as board members. And then we will also have opportunity to discuss together our own legislative priorities. If they are different, I imagine they will greatly overlap. And then even more future is I'm working to implement a timeline and process for the legislative position submitting process, which Seattle Public Schools Board has really participated more on an individual basis in the past, and I would like us to get that embedded into our process as a board so that we can, especially as the largest district in the state, make sure that we're prepared to, if we see holes in the legislative platform, we can be a position submitter and get something in front of the rest of the boards of the state for that collective advocacy, since we know that is so important and influential in getting what the resources and from the legislature and getting their priorities aligned with ours and what our schools and students and teachers need. So that's on Friday. I'll be sitting for 8 hours or something, just clicking yes or no on things. So that'll be fun. And anybody else who wants to any board directors who are interested you can pop in and out if you want and listen. And I will let you all know how it goes.
I just want to say thank you for doing that, Liza.
Oh, thanks.
Hands up for Director Rankin. We have now reached the consent portion.
Sorry.
You're good. Just want to make sure that your mic is off. You good? All right. We have now reached the consent portion of today's agenda. May I have a motion for the consent agenda?
I move approval of the consent agenda.
Second.
Approval of the consent agenda has been moved by Vice President Hampson and seconded by Director Rivera-Smith. Do directors have any items they would like to remove from the consent agenda? All right, seeing none. All those in favor of the agenda, please signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Okay, those opposed? All right, the consent agenda has passed unanimously. Okay, we will now move to the action items for today's agenda. Okay, let's take a look here. We only have one major action item for today's agenda, if I'm not mistaken.
Happy to offer a motion.
Yes, Vice President Hampson, the motion, please.
I move that the school board approve the 2022 to 2025 collective bargaining agreement for the SEA certificated non-supervisory employees, the professional staff, and the Seattle Association of Educational Office Personnel, and authorize the superintendent on behalf of the board of directors to execute the agreements in the form attached to the school board action report with any minor additions, deletions, and modifications deemed necessary by the superintendent, and to take any necessary actions to implement the terms of these agreements. Immediate action is in the best interest of the district.
Second.
Okay, this has been moved and properly seconded. Dr. Pritchett, if you would join us at the podium. Directors, if you have any questions before, or actually, Dr. Pritchett, are there remarks that you'd like to share with us?
I did have remarks.
Oh, then please, take it away.
All right.
Forgive me.
Thank you. Good evening. Dr. Sarah Pritchett, Interim Assistant Superintendent for Human Resources. The board action report being presented tonight for introduction and action would be to approve the collective bargaining agreements negotiated between representatives of Seattle Education Association and the Seattle School District. The three separate agreements are for a three-year commitment, a three-year period commencing September 1st, 2022 and ending August 31st, 2025. We believe this agreement represents elements of our district's values and beliefs centered on providing the best possible working conditions for our staff by enhancing and modifying the working conditions of our educators in support of our students, staff, and schools. This agreement would provide all 5,586 SEA represented educators increases in wages to maintain a competitive wage with a 7% increase in salary inclusive of IPD in the first year, followed by a guarantee of at least a 4% raise in the year 2023-24 and a guarantee of at least 3% raise in 2024-25. Additionally, this agreement provides all 1,700 SAOPs and paraprofessionals, classified staff with a one-time incentive of $1,500 in the 22-23 school year. I'd like to continue with just a few comments and highlights for folks regarding the highlights of this contract. I'll begin with the cost of this agreement, and as it's outlined in the bar, the total cost of this agreement over a three-year period is $231,183,529 million over the 3 years. And while we have done preliminary proactive budgeting in anticipation of this agreement, the net cost increase to our general funds in the year one would be an additional $12,526,380 million. The net cost increase to our general funds in year two would be an additional $33,521,531 million. And finally, the net cost increase to our general funds in year three would be an additional $48,021,836 million. This agreement includes additional supports for students and educators for our buildings. It includes mental health supports for secondary students by adding an additional 0.5 social worker at all K-8s, comprehensive middle and high schools for this school year and continuing on for the life of the contract. It would add 5 certificated nurses in the 23-24 school year, support workload relief and additional supports by lowering the counselor to student ratios at our highest needs secondary schools from one counselor for every 375 students to one counselor for every 350 students. Would support workload relief by lowering the staff to student ratios for speech and language specialists to one specialist for every 46 students this school year and one specialist for every 44 students in the following 2 years. This agreement also adds an additional race and equity advancement specialist in the 23-24 school year to support school-based race and equity teams. Additionally, as a learning organization, we value the attainment and encourage the pursuit of additional education, and to that end, this agreement offers incentives for continued learning, including the addition of a one-time incentive for teachers earning or holding an English language or dual language endorsements within the life of the contract, an increase to clock hour incentives for para-educators, and we've added an additional day of district-directed professional development. This agreement also provides increased funding to buildings and support to buildings, including extra time for office professionals to support the work that they do associated with the operation of school buildings, a $50,000 one-time library fund to support our highest needs schools, additional funding equivalent to $9 per student of dedicated library funding at each school to purchase culturally responsive library materials and collections. It adds additional extra time for each building's family-based support worker to support students and their families throughout the year and throughout the life of the contract. It continues our building safety team stipends of $2,000 per year for each school building. There are systemic changes that are included within this agreement. We have the addition of mediation services available to staff to resolve disputes. We have, for all substitute educators, mandatory pay for mandatory safety trainings as well as de-escalation trainings. And finally, I'd like to highlight that this agreement supports the initial steps into a more inclusive environment for our students receiving special education services and additional supports for our educators making changes to their instructional practice, including additional staffing added to resource services starting in the 2022-23 school year in order to support the elimination of satellite and continuum designations by the 24-25 school year. Access services for students with moderate to intensive needs will merge with social emotional learning services in the 23-24 school year, and the new services will be called extended resource. I would like to note that this represents a huge move towards inclusive practices and a necessary step to desegregate our special education programs. Students receiving extended resource instruction, including instruction to develop social emotional skills and social understanding, will spend the majority of their time in a general education classroom with a full range of supports needed. This agreement guarantees students receiving special education services have access to general education teachers, curricular materials, and instruction. Additionally, this agreement provides for professional development for all 5,000 plus educators to support inclusive instructional practices in serving students' individual learning needs. It allows for flexible staffing to allow school-level teams to determine how to best use staff to service students' needs. And finally, central office supports for scheduling to maximize inclusion in general education classrooms to the greatest extent possible for all students. This agreement also has systemic improvements related to special education, including a recommitment to a joint special education task force with members of the Seattle Education Association, special education central office staff, and family representatives to plan for transition to more inclusive practices throughout the system. This task force will also work collaboratively to develop a workload calculator to support individual student needs while attending to the workload considerations for educators. Additionally, IEP teams considering moving students to a different school must include department specialists or supervisors before that move can be made. Those are just brief highlights to this 3-year agreement. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer those at this time, noting that I will have some of my colleagues come if there are particular questions that need to be answered more specifically. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Pritchett. Do we have any questions from directors? Go ahead, Director Rivera-Smith.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Pritchett. And first, I can't obviously start without saying thank you to all of our negotiators, SPS and SEAs, who worked tremendously hard on this agreement. And I don't think that can be overlooked at all, because it's a lot of hours and a lot of rooms, late nights, I understand, and we appreciate you guys being there to do this for everybody. I have a couple of questions. I'll start with maybe an easier one. Are educators' pay being retroactive back to the September 1st start date of this contract?
That is correct.
They are, okay. And then as far as making up the days lost for the strike, do we know how those will be made? Will they be made up according to the CBA, where it's, well, there's a couple different ways it could be done, so I'll ask you just easy.
I'll go ahead and elaborate on that. There is new language in the contract, but that would be reflective of as school boards negotiate or approve a entire school contract. So the addition of community input would mean would be reflective of the next school year's contract, because this contract has already been approved. We've entered into negotiations with SEA and spoke with our other labor partners, and we would be proposing to come forward with the board at the next board meeting to propose a new calendar with the adjustments to this to the makeup days for the board's approval.
That's great, thank you. Sorry, and my last question, there's a lot in this. It's a really robust contract. Clearly, there's so many places to touch on. I try to look at it through the lens of where are our students represented in this. And I know, I mean, we think we all know the students were not involved in the negotiations. They're only maybe tangentially involved in that we represent our communities, which includes students, and we guide the district. But I think, and I'll get, it's kind of a longer segue here, but Article 2, the partnerships for ensuring educational and racial equity, under number 4, building leadership team program, leadership teams. Under bullet E, it states, one of the shared beliefs is that those impacted by decisions must be given an opportunity to be involved in the decision making. And it's talking about paras and SEOPs, but it does later then state that the building leadership teams and building program committees will include parents, guardians, students, and community representatives as appropriate. And I would question and counter that it's always appropriate for students to be involved in their building decision making. And I don't know that this needed to be in the CBA, because I understand this is about the staff, and maybe on our side is where I'd like us to be more intentional about how our students are involved in these decision making processes and outlining it. So, because I know in right now in policy, we don't say they must be, or they shall be, or will be. It's they may be, and so we don't see it a lot in some of our schools. Some do, some don't. Anyhow, I just really appreciate our student speaker earlier and Director Crombaron speaking on that themselves, about the importance of having student voice in all these things that we do. And this is a really big one where we didn't really see it, and I would love us to find ways to make that happen. I guess even, I would say in 3 years, but obviously there are going to be maybe reopeners and other opportunities of negotiation going on in this contract over the next 3 years. And hopefully we can get to a place where that is something that is the norm and not the exception. So thank you.
Any other questions from directors? Go ahead, Director Harris.
Thank you so much. We had a work session on this that was recorded and talked a great deal about the costs of this. And I'm hoping that Deputy Superintendent Gannon can come up and talk about what our deficits are for years 2 and 3. And I want to preface this that I believe that we reached a good collective bargaining agreement, but that it comes at a price with extraordinary deficits. And I will say yet again, for the record, this district, our labor partners, other districts need to file McClary 2, because McClary 1 is fake news, and the legislature has not in any way, shape, or form done right by the school districts, the school district staffs, and most importantly, the students in Washington State public schools K through 12. And frankly, I don't see that changing anytime soon unless we get together and leverage. But these are very, very dark days ahead, and I think that we need to be very, very clear on that. And I want to be a member of a board that pays our classified staff more than you can make at Dick's Drive-In. I am distressed appalled, not new news whatsoever. And if our children are not that important, then what the heck are we doing? Anyway, I would like those numbers on the record if Deputy Gannon can put them there. And I invite people who subscribe to blogs and social media and who fill a vacuum that we do not put out good communication with all kinds of crazy, and apparently crazy is the wrong word, tinfoil hat conspiracy theories, incorrect information. I invite them to take the time to get on YouTube and take a look at the work sessions where we're doing really good work. And everybody here is busting their chops, and here as well. And frankly, some of the negativity that's thrown back our way is most not appreciated. Thank you.
Good evening, directors, Deputy Superintendent Rob Gannon. Director Harris, trying to respond to your questions briefly. In our work session 2 weeks ago, I forecasted a net deficit in fiscal year 23-24 of approximately $47.5 million. For fiscal year 24-25, the subsequent year, I forecasted a shortfall of about $139.4 million. I gave those figures to the board in the work session verbally, and I just want to let you all know that we have a more detailed presentation on the out-year implications for the budget broadly and some of the implications of the contract specifically, prepared to come to the board in the next regular meeting, where President Hersey has approved a work session within the context of the full board meeting. So we'll be able to brief the board in full at their next meeting on the out-year implications.
All right. Any other questions from directors? Director Rankin, and then we will go to Director Luna Kronberg. Okay.
Not a question, but I just wanted to put it on the record that all-encompassing statements made about the directors from other directors with negativity towards Seattle Education Association, teacher unions, student unions, anything like that, I do not endorse or condone as a student board member. I do not consider myself educated enough on all of these issues to have an identified opinion that I would state on public record. But I just wanted to say that I know that my teachers, my educators, my community cares about me as a student and loves our students and wants what's best for our students. And I would like to recognize that. And again, I do not associate myself with any comments of negativity made towards teacher or student unions. Thank you.
Okay. Director Rankin.
Thank you. I have a lot of comments, questions, concerns, reflections that I'm going to save for another time because I'm well aware that what we are being asked to consider right now is the acceptance of this exact contract. But I do have the great desire for a post-mortem of sorts, reflection about processes going forward. Now is not the time, which I totally understand. So specific to this, the adjustments that were made to social, emotional, physical health that corresponded with, staffing increases in those areas that somewhat corresponded with state law that passed, increasing those allocations, but we are still staffing above those allocations. Can you tell me what the difference is, if there was any, of the staffing numbers that were landed at in the contract as compared to what was approved and directed by the board as part of the budget process at the end of last year?
Can you ask that in perhaps a different way? I'm
Sorry,
trying
yes.
to understand which question.
In conversation on budget development over last year, last school year, excuse me, in preparation for approval of the budget in July for this year, there was priority placed on, and I can't remember what month work session we talked about it, but budget work session about increasing staffing in the areas of physical, social, and emotional health, psychologists, nurses, social workers, counselors. So we had talked about that as a budget priority, increasing allocations within SPS. And then, or I can't remember, in tandem with that, the state also passed legislation to increase allocations in the prototypical school model for nurses, counselors, social workers. And the legislation is still under what we as Seattle Public Schools staff. But my question is, the increase, the projected increase over several years that we discussed in budget development, how does that increase align with the increase in those resources in this contract? Did this contract see an increase in that staffing as compared to what was approved by the board in the budget? Is it the same? Is it, where did we end up compared to what was prioritized and approved by the board and what we landed on?
I would say that the additional staffing is an increase to what was approved. So it goes above and beyond what the what was approved.
And is that across all those areas, or that specifically the 0.5 social workers?
The 0.5 social workers, the 5 certificated nurses, and by default, when you lower the ratios of staff, so like if you look at speech and language folks and you lower the ratio over the life of the contract, you will add more staff.
Okay. Well, speech and language I don't think was included in that.
But those are just the ones that are actually the things that we've added. But specifically, your social, the 0.5 social workers and the nurses are an increase.
Okay. And so the kind of projected increase that we had done in our budget development, what am I trying to ask? Are we basically implementing some of those things sooner? Or will we continue to increase those in our budget development? And I know I'm asking questions from when you were in a different position than you're in now. Yeah, and that we don't have our budget and finance person who led that conversation. Right. But I'm trying to figure out, in our budget projections and staffing projections, we had authorized an increase or prioritized an increase in some of those positions. And so will we continue to see over the next several years increase every year as we had already directed? Or where?
Yes, I'll have Linda see.
I'm sure I'm asking this in a more complicated way than necessary, but I'm looking for the intersection between those two things.
Go ahead.
Good evening, Linda Sebring, Budget Director. So I understand the question you're asking is the state has increased the prototypical school model for social emotional positions, and we had some conversation back after the legislative session ended as to what our strategy might be, recognizing that at the time we are about 100 FTE above what the state funds in that area. So as Dr. Pritchard mentioned, the contract, while we are all recognizing, like the legislature, that we need more social emotional supports, was not tied in any way to additional resources from the state. And as you know, the state prototypical model is based on enrollment. So we're still, it's going to depend on what our future outlook is for enrollment. We have not made any decisions. As Dr. Pritchard mentioned, this is kind of a additional early payment on those staff that we're hoping to get. But part of our conversation with the state has been, we have put these resources out there and we need you to help us pay for them. And this is what's caused a lot of our structural deficit, is we've been in front of the state, even though we strongly recognize we need more supports. So hopefully that answers your question. Again, no decisions yet on what might happen in the future. Our financial planning is including estimates for those revenues to come in, but we have not made decisions to continue to expand above what we've already described.
Okay, and those the increases are all in year one, or are they over the life of the 3 years of the CBA?
The increases on the CBA, as noted, vary. So
Okay.
there's 0.5 social workers going in place into comprehensive secondary schools this school year. So if the board votes to approve this tonight, we will be working very hard to get the FTE loaded so that Human Resources could start recruiting for those positions in this school year. Additional 5 certificated nurses would be in next school year.
Okay, thank you. I'll have to look back and see what we said compared to that. My other question is also super specific. It has to do with the task forces. So what I have brought up in other meetings, I think I want some clarity on the commitment of the outcome of the task forces, because we saw confusion in part of this bargain as to previously agreed upon task force work and then what that actually meant in context for implementation in terms of it being a labor pre-agreement, or you know what I mean? Basically what I'm getting at is I don't want to see the rights of kids be up for public negotiation again. And if all parties are agreed to something, I would like to see us do it. And then the other thing is that I know that the task forces in the currently in the 2019-2022 collective bargaining agreement had parent representation on it, which is great, except for that parents are not a partner in a labor negotiation. So that was confusing for me. And also that in those task forces, that the representatives from both sides of the table, from SEA and SPS, were doing that as part of their paid work, which makes sense, it should be, but that parents were asked to give their time for free. And that just seems kind of setting up not the best mutually understood outcome for all parties. So I just want to make sure that we are being really, really clear in setting up a task force in a bargaining agreement, that that's about labor, and that if we want community input and discussion around outcomes for students, that needs to be in a setting where parents and students can participate in those in the same way that district and SEA representatives are participating, as opposed to being sort of unpaid add-ons, if that makes sense. And I'm not trying to disparage the work that was done. It just sort of, to me, set up a really kind of odd dynamic that played out in ways that I really don't want to see happen again. So I want to make sure that the commitment that we're making going forward on task forces is more clear. Can you address that at all?
I can have Dr. Pedroza or Dr. Torres come up and talk about specifically what the task force was designed, or what it's designed to do in this particular contract, or what we've agreed to in this particular contract.
That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Good evening, and thank you for the question, Director Rankin. So I just want to put a little bit of clarity that when we did the special education task force between SEA Vice President UT Hawkins and myself, we were really, really, really clear with the task force that we were bringing these forward as recommendations for both the SPS management side and the SEA labor side, but that the actual bargaining would happen between those two sides at the table. And so while they were recommendations, there was never a guarantee that everything that was in the recommendations would be making it into the agreement, but that there was shared interest in these being the topics that would be discussed or brought into the special education portion. As far as the task force that's written in the tentative agreement moving forward, there was a shared commitment, and it is written in there that we will share out a reporting by the last day of school at the end of the 22-23 school year. Did that help address your question?
Kind of. Are parents being, so in a contract agreement between SPS and SEA, making a parent commitment when parents are not part of that agreement, I'm just wondering what that involvement is expected to be from parents?
And as far as on the task force?
If
Yeah.
that same expectation is there?
So as with the way the tentative agreement reads, there is, it does read that we will involve parents in the task force. The purpose of involving parents, of course, is because that is one of the important people at the table when you think about special education servicing. However, since it is a labor agreement between SPS and our labor partners, it would not dictate or delineate anything regarding compensation or any such things for parents, as this is more dealing with educators and the management side of the team.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions from our directors before we move on to the vote? Okay, seeing none, thank you, Dr. Pritchett, and thank you all who were able to provide context in that discussion. Ms. Wilson-Jones, the roll call, please.
Director Rivera-Smith.
Aye.
Was that an aye? Sorry.
It was aye.
Director Sarju.
Aye.
Director Song Moritz.
Aye.
Vice President Hampson.
Aye.
Director Harris.
Aye.
Director Rankin.
Aye.
President Hersey.
Aye.
This motion has passed unanimously.
Before we move on to the next item in today's agenda, I just wanted to take the chair's privilege to thank everybody who participated in what was quite literally a Herculean effort. Thank you to our educators. I see we have President Motter in the back. Appreciate you being here with us. Obviously, Vice President Hawkins spoke earlier, but also to SPS staff who spent countless hours at the bargaining table with our Education Association, trying to get a contract that really represents the needs of our students, their families, our community in an educational environment. And what I will just say is many things can be true at the same time, right? Do our educators deserve to have a living wage and to be able to afford to live in the city where they teach? Hell yes. Do we currently know the best strategies to figure out how to accommodate that within our subsequent budgets? We made it very clear that the answer to that question is no. I think that what this does highlight is an opportunity for a collaborative approach to not only advocacy to the legislature, but also in many ways how we fund schools not only in the city of Seattle, but also across our district, because I know for a fact that we are not the only ones in this situation. I think that it speaks volumes to the fact that our state currently does spend over 50% of its budget on K-12 education, and that's clearly not enough. Coming from the great state of Mississippi, which is oftentimes regarded in the bottom of 50 states as it pertains to education, Washington is not that far above, but we are probably 10 times more wealthy in many respects. I think that over the longevity of, however long we occupy these seats here, there's a lot to be learned from how do we do these processes more effectively, but even more so, how do we convince our entire community as a whole that education is not something that you only experience from the ages to 5 to 18, that everybody benefits from a strong, healthy, and thriving public school system, and we have to be able to fund that system as things like demand for wages, resources become more and more expensive. And so what I just want folks to understand is that while we agree that there are lots of things that we could be funding, we as a school board, as an education association, as senior staff, do not hold the purse strings in this particular instance. So in order for us to figure out how do we generate more funding, a big part of that is going to be conversations with our legislative partners, with our other governments and communities and things like that, to really think holistically about where do we see ourselves reflected, not only in the betterment of our schools, but also how do we fund those schools appropriately. So with that being said, there's been a request that we take a short break before we move into the next section of today's agenda. I'm going to give us a 6-minute recess. Please be back promptly at 6:30. Thank you so much. We will see you very soon. We received a presentation on the process of redistricting and analysis of our existing director districts. Last week, the executive committee then received a board action report for this draft redistricting plan with 3 potential redistricting scenarios developed by Flow Analytics for the committee's consideration. The executive committee voted to move forward the bar with a recommendation for approval of scenario 1 as our redistricting plan. Tonight, you have that recommendation before you for introduction, and the alternative scenarios considered are also provided for your reference. Flow Analytics will be presenting these scenarios with supporting analysis tonight. Directors are invited to ask questions and share feedback for potential iteration on the draft redistricting plan, which is scenario 1. If we have interest in potential revisions to the draft redistricting plan, then I will schedule an additional session on the draft redistricting plan on October 12th, and will ask directors to be prepared to offer any suggested changes at that time. This will then allow us to prepare and republish revised draft redistricting plans if necessary, in time for further public review and comment and action during our October 26th regular board meeting. While we do plan to complete this work on October 26th, our statutory deadline is November the 15th. I will pass it to General Counsel Narver to begin the presentation.
Thank you, President Hersey. Greg Narver, General Counsel. I'm going to just make a few brief comments and then turn the presentation over to our consultants from Flow Analytics, who will be doing a presentation virtually. And then Assistant Superintendent Redmond will come up and talk about the public engagement process here. One point I want to just illustrate a little bit that President Hersey made is that our usual process, as you are aware, is that we introduce an item, staff makes the introduction at one board meeting, and then at a later board meeting, the board takes final action on that matter. And it's at that time usually that amendments to the board action are considered. There's a bit of a wrinkle on this one, though. We can't wait until the 26th to take up amendments because as we've discussed both in the prior work session and also at the executive committee last week, we have statutory criteria that we have to meet for the director districts, one of which is to try and get the population within each district as equal as possible. And so if amendments are being offered, we need time to get the proposed revisions to Flow Analytics, who can crunch the census data and produce maps that continue to comply with those statutory criteria. We also need to leave time for a technical review by King County Elections, which looks at those boundaries to make sure that in laying our boundaries over existing boundaries for the state legislature, for city council, congressional districts, we're not inadvertently creating precincts that have no voters in them. So King County Elections does a quick technical review and maybe nudges the lines a block or two to make sure that we haven't done that. So what we're going to do, if there, and as President Hersey said, there's one scenario that was the preferred scenario by executive committee, but there are 2 alternatives. We're now, as Assistant Superintendent Redmond will tell you, receiving a lot of public comment about them. I believe we've already received over 100 comments. That's the way this is supposed to work. We're going to have in-person public comment from people who wish to address it. And so all of that's going to be taken into consideration, but that if there are amendments that the board wants to put forward to move the lines around, we really kind of need to get those resolved at the next board meeting. And so in addition to it being an additional introduction opportunity, it's really at the next board meeting that we'll have to have the board be prepared to act on any amendments it wants to bring for action so that we do give time for that review to take place. So that's the difference of this. In this process, we really can't do amendments on the 26th without pushing the deadline for action back even further. With that, I'm going to introduce Ken and Gavin from Flow. You've met them before. They were here on the meeting on the 31st. They're going to walk through a PowerPoint that focuses mostly on scenario 1 that was approved by the executive committee, but they'll also be prepared to answer questions about the other scenarios. and answer any questions you have about the process. And then Assistant Superintendent Redmond will talk about the public engagement, and then we'll turn it over for public comment. I'll answer any questions you have of me, but other than that, we'll turn it over to the consultants. Thank you.
All right, well, good evening, President Hersey, members of the board, and Superintendent Jones. Yeah, we're appreciate the opportunity to present to you again. Well, first off, just look at the timeline, and Mr. Narver did a nice job of explaining kind of the back end of this timeline. And so we did have an initial workshop with that executive committee on the 13th to present some initial scenarios, 3 in total. One of those was brought forward tonight for your consideration as a draft map. And we do have time in this process, though, for some revisions. And so, as Mr. Narver stated, we've received quite a bit of public comment. What we need, however, is some action determinations through the board via the executive committee so that we can provide some possible amendments to this recommended scenario if indeed the board wants to continue moving in the direction with this scenario. So we have some time in there. I didn't put the October 12th in there yet, but we are prepared to bring some amendments forward on the 12th and or simply hear some suggested amendments from the board as well after this public hearing tonight. So we're prepared for that. And then we do have the October 26th meeting as one where we can show those adjustments to the preferred scenario from the board. So next slide, just a reminder about the process. We do need to follow these guidelines. They are in Washington law, as you can see. Need to really work to make each board district nearly as equal in total population, not school population, as possible. Each district needs to be compact, contiguous, and then should not be used for the purposes of favoring or disfavoring any racial group or political party. We do try to maintain communities of interest. A lot of the input that we're receiving now is around communities of interest and some suggestions from patrons as to how to preserve those in certain areas that this scenario we're going to present tonight perhaps might split in some manner. And so those are some points that we really need some direction moving forward in order to make modifications to this scenario. The next slide shows once again just the existing conditions. So from remember, every 10 years this needs to occur with the release of the census data. And so from 10 years past in 2010 census, what has happened over time is there's been some uneven growth in the district. And so if you look, the ideal population, once again, is just calculated by taking the total population within the district. And in this case, since there's 7 school board districts, we take that total and divide it by 7, and we get to that ideal population of 105,322. So as you can see, there is some overall deviation from that. It's at 29% currently. So our work is to get that under 5%. Ideally, in a large district, we can often approach 1% or lower. And so that's really what our task was. The next slide just shows another factor that we take a look at based on redistricting guidelines, and that's the census, the citizen voting age population survey. And so that information from 2019 was the last time it was published. And we take a look at that information with every scenario that we create as well. So this shows the current breakdown from that CVAP from 2019. And for each of our scenarios, you'll see an updated version of this for each scenario. So I'm going to pass it over to Gavin. Gavin will review once again the preferred scenario from the executive committee, which is scenario 1. And then he'll also just toggle over to an interactive map that he can kind of move in and out of, and he'll show you the current boundaries in relation to scenario 1's modified boundaries. So I'm going to pass it over to Gavin for the next few slides and for that interactive map demo.
Okay, so again, this is scenario 1, the preferred draft map. We were actually able to get that overall deviation to 0.2%. So that being none of the districts will deviate from that ideal population more than 0.1%. And going to the CVAP, or the citizen voting age population breakdown, that's kind of how this looks like right here. We're gonna, again, circle back to an interactive map of scenario 1 so we can get a closer look at the changes. We do want to put some eyes on scenario 2 and 3. Scenario 2's intent being to keep neighborhoods together as much as possible, but in doing so, that overall deviation increases to 0.5%, and kind of see where that happens in District 7, Districts 1, Districts 2, and District 4. And the citizen voting age population breakdown, it's relatively similar to scenario 1. At the most, there's single-digit changes. Moving on to scenario 3, this was drawn with emphasis on having boundaries aligned with voter precincts. So the overall deviation is going to be higher than scenario 1 and 2 at 3.4%. It's notable in that District 3 is 1.5%. Deviates 1.5% from that ideal, whereas District 5 deviates 1.9%. Here's that citizen voting age population breakdown again.
If I could add one thing to this, as Gavin brings up the interactive map to show you scenario 1 in a little more detail. One thing that we notice in our work, and we work with districts that are very large, districts that are very small, as well as municipalities for their city council. We've worked with counties for their commissioner districts. And the higher the population in a certain area, so in this case, over 700,000 population in Seattle Public School District, really that overall deviation we try to get lower and lower. It's just more defensible when you're in a larger area with a much higher population. If we're in a city that has, or a county, in fact, that has maybe 10,000 residents, it's really hard to get that overall deviation down to a number that's much lower than 10%. And so when we're looking at these scenarios, and we see some scenarios we can create that are 0.1 and 0.2% versus one that's 3.4%, generally in a large district, as I said, the lower number will be more defensible. Now, with that said, we also want to make sure that there's input from the community and from the board in terms of those communities of interest. Because if it looks like we might be able to get by with a higher deviation, I'd still like to keep it under 3% for Seattle Public Schools because of the size. But we could approach that more, even approach 1% or a little over 1% if we're maintaining some communities of interest. And so that's just something to think about as we move through this process.
Right. So this is that interactive map that Kent was referring to earlier. Right now, we have scenario 1's boundaries pulled up. I'm going to go ahead and turn on the existing director district boundaries so you can kind of get a visual of what those changes look like. I'm also going to overlay school locations as well. And then, yeah, I'm just going to kind of get into the changes that we made and why we made them. So again, we're focused on getting that total overall deviation as low as possible. Districts 6 and 7 were pretty well under the ideal population. So we had to reach up into District 5 to get them closer to it. And in order to maintain contiguity, District 6 had to push east. And then the portions that District 6 and 7 would pull from District 5, even though District 5 is a little bit over that ideal, it would end up being under. So as a result, District 5 will move up into District 4. And then between District 3 and 5, there's going to be a little bit of a give and take. This is in order to meet that criteria of compactness, kind of having to smooth out and flatten this area right here. And then between the remaining districts, there's quite a bit of shifting around. It's worth noting that Districts 3 and Districts 4 are both connected. They're connected via, not to themselves, but they're connected to different areas within their districts via bridge. And then, so the areas south of those bridges, the only changes will be the ones that I just noted between districts 3, the top boundary of districts 5, and then the southern boundaries of 3 and 4. And then, yeah, coming up here, a lot of focus was given towards reducing District 4's population, which was considerably over the ideal, and then increasing District 1, which was pretty under the ideal. So to start off, we had District 2 reach out west into District 4, but in doing so, this would put District 2 over. So we had District 1 reach down south to put 2 closer back to that ideal. But at this point now, 1 is over and 4 is slightly under. But what I also want to mention is that 3, with the changes made here, is also under. So as such, we balanced out all the remaining districts by having 3 and 4 take from 1, and which also served to make 1 more compact. Yeah, so.
Let's just pause for a minute. Could you pull up District 1, make it kind of fill the screen as much as you can? So this is a good example of the term compactness that's used. And so there's actually some calculations that can be run on compactness, and there's different scales that actually verify compactness for different geographies. We like to also use the eye test. So if you look at the current District 1, and that's the district within the pink outline, that's the current District 1. You can see that it looks like kind of a crescent moon shape, kind of upside down moon shape. It's kind of longer and thinner a little bit on the ends. What this does in this scenario, you can see it makes it more box-like. So this scenario, it's everything in that light blue is now District 1, and it's a little more box-like, and the more boxy that you can get, or I would say the more circular you could get, is really the best. But something that looks more uniform, that's a measure of compactness. And so the compactness scales would now say that District 1 is more compact than it was before. And so that's just a visual representation of that idea of compactness I wanted to share tonight. Yeah. So as we go back, we can pause now for questions from the board, or we can continue. I think there is another slide that we were going to ask Ms. Redmond to relay back to the board in terms of the communications plan and what's been received so far and what the plans are moving forward. So maybe let's go back to that, and then we can pause for any questions from the board.
And actually, before I turn it over to Assistant Superintendent Redmond, I wanted to make one comment to the board. All the public input we've been receiving is being provided to the board and to Flow Analytics. Some of it's kind of general, some of it's very specific. I urge the board to look carefully at those comments to see if they resonate with you about changes that maybe ought to be made. And then we can work to make sure that any ideas you have about suggestions you'd like to make go to Flow so that they can run the census data and see if there's a doable map that complies with that. And then those can all be talked through when we have the meeting on the 12th. So I think the time right now is just to make sure that we receive all the public comment, that the board has a chance to consider it, to see if any of it suggests to you changes that you'd like to make. Then we can take those to Flow to make sure that we can produce a map that's statutory compliant that will come back to the board, and then at the meeting on the 12th, the board can, if directors feel it appropriate, suggest amendments to the scenario that the executive committee proposed. So that's what I'm going to suggest on, because I know you've already seen some of it and you're going to hear more tonight. I want to make sure it all gets considered, and then the board has a chance to publicly advocate for changes that they may feel are appropriate once it's had a chance to be vetted. Does that make sense? All right. Yes, Director Song-Moritz?
Confirm that any suggested amendments we want to make, we should give on the 12th and not tonight?
Yes. Right now, we're still in the intake process, and there's still more to hear. And I'd like that opportunity to take place so the board has a chance to review all of that public input and then see if there are amendments you wish to take place. We've built in extra time. Nothing needs to be proposed, and there's no action item tonight. As I said, on the 12th, it's going to going to kind of be a hybrid reintroduction if there's a new scenario, but also decisions to be made by the board about what's going to go forward to decision on the 26th, since we can't introduce new things on the 26th. So there will absolutely be time for directors to propose amendments. I think tonight's not the right night to talk those through. What we should be doing is still listening to the public engagement that's going on. There will absolutely be an opportunity to propose changes. Thank you.
Good evening to the board.
Hold on one second. I think that there might be a couple of questions before we move on to the next section.
Okay.
So if we could get those addressed, that would be great.
We can do it if you'd like.
Thank you. Couple of questions here. One, given the fact that we have the same population for the school board director redistricting as the Seattle City Council has, are we going to see transparent maps laid on top of each other, and might we be, since they have to follow the same rules, contiguous, communities of interest, yada, 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 are we reinventing the wheel here is part of my question, and at what cost, both time, money, etc. My second question is Flo going to be vetting the numbers with their interactive map? Because if for instance, making Chinatown International District one district as opposed to being split between three, as the community has very eloquently stated their position recently. So that would necessarily change the other districts. So are we going to have that kind of real-time technical assistance? It's going to be like sausage making. We might need to bring our pillows and sleeping bags.
I'll address both those. First of all, we're not reinventing the wheel. The boundaries of Seattle Public Schools are very similar to the city of Seattle. They are not identical. There are portions of Seattle Public Schools that lie outside the boundaries of the city of Seattle, and vice versa. There are portions of the city of Seattle that are in the Highline School District. It's not identical. It's very, very close, but it's not identical. We are charged by statute with running our own process, receiving our own input from the public, and the analysis of what constitutes a community of interest may be different if you're talking about city representation as opposed to who you vote for the school board. So we are charged with running our own process. We have to do it every 10 years, and we have to run it separately from the city. They are the same standards. The maps may look similar, but we run our own analysis and we do our own vote. As to number two, yes, that's the process I perhaps inelegantly described before. Any changes directors want to see as a result of public comment, including perhaps the international district or other things that you're hearing, those all need to go to Flo, so that they're the masters of the numbers, and they can move a map and tell you, based on the census data, what effect did that have on the deviation from the ideal population. And if it's too much, you've got to find some territory somewhere else. That's what they do. They need time to do that, and so if there is public input that is persuasive to you and you would like to develop an amendment to propose a change to scenario one, they need time to run those numbers. We need time to get it to King County. They need about a day or two to do a double check. That's why we've built in all this extra time. So yes, absolutely they can do it. Ideally, we get that to them pretty soon so they have time to run those numbers and we're not laying out bedrolls and pillows here and keeping them up all night.
So does that information then go to you, kind sir? And/or what about, again, the unintended consequences? If we've got a problem with one boundary, then how do we know in our amendment whether or not at that point, before they do the calculations?
I would like to spare Flo from getting 300 separate emails asking them to run numbers. I think if you can communicate with me and with the board office, we're in touch with Flo a lot. We can help funnel that, and so that we can focus their work on coming up with some alternatives. Make sure that what comes back to you as something you might propose as an amendment has gone through the process and been vetted, and that we can have confidence when the board votes on the 26th that what we're voting on is going to be compliant with the statute.
Director Sargey.
So I have two questions. One is a yes, no, and then the second one is a why. At the onset of this, when you drew the initial map, did you overlay it with the redlining maps?
That's for Flo to answer. They created the maps.
Yeah, we do. But we take the existing boundaries and then we shift them. So we have the overlay so that we can see what our changes are, and then we catalog each scenario. So the scenarios that we brought forward, the 3 scenarios that you've seen, we have a catalog of those against the existing boundaries. The reason that we don't always present the existing boundaries with the new boundary at the same time is it can get very cluttered within the map. And so it's very difficult, to see. And so I believe in this process, they were kept separate when they were put on the district website, which is practice that we've seen. But when we do the modeling, we most certainly not only know exactly where those boundaries differ from the current or from an existing scenario boundary, we can run those statistical calculations so that we can see every single statistic for each of the modified districts, and then and we get the same output that you've seen in terms of the ethnicity, race, and ethnicity tables as well.
I'm not sure you understood my question. Specifically the redlining map. Did you overlay that?
Can you explain what you mean by redlining map?
In the city of Seattle, I live in a red line neighborhood, for example, and that was an intentional racist process to prohibit specifically African Americans and Jews, and I think they maybe had one other disparaging Asians, the continent, right, because it's a continent. So it was a map that was specifically drawn where we could not buy outside of that. There were racial covenants. So it is important to understand the history of why we are where we are. And so my question was specifically, did you utilize the redlining maps as you began to consider the work?
No. I misunderstood your question entirely. I was referring to that pink outline that we showed you on the interactive map of the current boundaries. So we did not look at any maps that you're describing that would have any sort of traditional neighborhoods in that. We looked at, just really almost kind of common maps that you would find like on Google and that sort of thing that would just show a kind of a general area where a neighborhood is, but we don't know where neighborhoods start and necessarily. So I totally misunderstood your question. We haven't looked at the type of map you're describing when we do our work.
And I just would like to propose that that's important. At least it's important for the Black folks who are left here. I'm trying to compose myself. I'm just going to stop.
Yeah, I apologize for misunderstanding your question at the outset.
Go ahead, Director Hampson, and then we will go to Beto.
I don't know if it got sent along to you, but one of the things that I found after getting some questions from constituents was the proposed map for the city by the Washington Redistricting Council, which seemed to be a pretty reputable group of individuals trying to provide, in anticipation of redistricting, some ideas around potential lines for city districts. They, in many ways, look fine to me, as does in terms of the makeup and the neighborhoods that are represented in that district. If all things were equal, the populations and the demographics remained the same, that we weren't disenfranchising or breaking up neighborhoods, it seemed to be a good option. And it would, I don't know what the city's going to do, but it is something that's been recommended to the city. And I'm wondering if we've taken that, that this community group did this work to put together some recommendations, and whether or not that's something that we've considered. Did we look to any of those outside suggestions?
We've not looked at the city council maps. We have different boundaries in our own process.
No, and I recognize that, and we don't nobody's advocating specifically for, school board districts. And I do want to say that I think and this is really to Assistant Superintendent Redmond, is that the title? That there's not a clear understanding that we're actually elected by the entire city. So these director districts are kind of a false notion of representation, and that the top two advance in the district, and then the entire city decides who's on the school board. And we are a body of 7 who vote together, not as individual people. We take a vote, but the intent and best governance practice is that we are one team, and we all represent every single constituent throughout the entire city, not just in our districts. And then at the same time, looking that there have been some ways to divide the city up into 7 parts that seem potentially relevant, whether or not there's anything we can learn from that relative to our districts. I again would imagine creating massive change would be also difficult, but if there are, when I look at the district in which I was elected, what's proposed looks like the neighborhood looks like the overall neighborhood as I know and use it, right? Like the whole area. And so I can see how that ended up being that district. I also want to acknowledge that the objective review is also really important, because the city is changing really quickly. And I think that's evidenced in some of the other data that we see in the 1, 2, and 3 scenarios. But was just wanting to ask that we look at some of these scenarios that have been presented by outside entities who are trying to advocate for voters who have been historically disenfranchised.
I'm glad you raised the point about, we have tried to say it as many times as we can. This really impacts one thing: who people vote for in the primary. I had a long conversation with a member of the media the other day who kept asking me questions about how this would affect funding for schools and resources and attendance zones. And I kept saying, not at all, not at all. It affects one thing: who's on the ballot for the primary election. Then in the general, everybody votes. The 7 of you are all elected citywide. That's it. But I think we've run out of words to say that's all this affects, but somehow something's not connecting. And I'm going to let the communications expert take it from there. As far as more closely modeling the city maps, we can propose anything. They just need time to make sure that we can make it district compliant. And it's a tricky thing. It's got to be contiguous, got to be compact, et cetera.
Understood. Yeah, I think this board is very open. At the same time, the impact, the outcome, I think that's one thing that we are not necessarily hearing, is what is the outcome that we seek from the changes that we make, because the redistricting process is not necessarily one in which we're that equips us to make decisions that have an outcome that we might think that we seek, if in fact we're all based on districts when in fact we're actually elected as the city. But
And in terms of the city changing, obviously the disparity in, for example, in District 4 shows how the population patterns are changing and the need to shift districts 6 and 7 farther north to accommodate more people. The law requires us to use the census numbers. We're not allowed to forecast what we think the growth patterns will be over the next 10 years. Whoever is standing at this podium 10 years from now is probably presenting a very different picture, but what we have to use is what the census data produced.
So can we have your commitment that you will send to, I'm sorry, he not.
I'm sorry.
Then is, do we have your commitment that you will send the historic redlining maps to the Flow group so they can see what our historical issues have been, to the extent that there are questions about where to cut those lines and they have any leeway?
If somebody can, I don't know where to find that map.
It's everywhere.
It's not absolutely not part of what the statute asks us to consider. It doesn't preclude people from looking at it. Yeah, somebody wants to
Does it preclude Flow from using it when there is scooch room and communities in contiguous areas and communities?
Any map that complies with those 5 statutory criteria that the board wants to approve is fine.
I've got a follow-up question to that, and I just want to ask my colleagues, so there are 2 conversations that are happening here. There's the acknowledgement that Seattle is built on a very racist and discriminatory structure that likely impacts everybody up on this dais in some way, shape, or form. There's the other piece in what I'm struggling to understand, acknowledging that to be true, and what I'm asking for help in understanding, and what I think our colleagues at Flow and General Counsel Narver would appreciate as well, is what do we hope, what is the intended outcome of utilizing those maps? Because there's things that we can acknowledge are problems, and then there are also the avenues that we have to address those problems. I don't see the connection between what we can do here and addressing those problems, especially given that the school board has nothing to do with restructuring where people live. So I'm really, and this is me coming from a place of humble naivete, please, somebody explain to me very clearly what that desired outcome is. Can either of my colleagues that are advocating for that do that for me?
I'd like to take a shot at it, if I might, please. I think that it goes to sensitivity and respect, and a whole lot of what we do in this city, how we zone, how we sell real estate, where we put single-family homes, where we put multi-family homes, where we put all kinds of services, are historically based on the redlining maps, and we're still stuck with them. And to the extent that we have scooch room on the edges in terms of numbers, and the overlay of that map, that sensitivity and respect needs to be taken into account.
I hear you. I am still struggling to see how that is directly related to what we are trying to accomplish here, which is balancing the voting districts. And I want to give it to Director Sarju, and then I really want to hear from our student director. So if we could expedite that process, that would be good.
We cannot deny that the reason why we're even having this conversation is because of history. And either by acts of commission or omission or silence, we send a message to particularly the Black folks that representation doesn't matter. Whether or not that's your intent, I'm not talking about anybody's intent. I'm talking about impact. And this is not a criticism of flow, but because these types of policies and situations are deliberately left out of our historical psyche, we end up exacerbating. I shouldn't even be talking about redlining at this point. And when I saw the first map, I was like, I had just done the redlining walk. If you overlay it, it's stunning. And I reached out to a couple of my board members because I actually couldn't believe what I was seeing. And I wanted to ensure that I wasn't misinterpreting what I was seeing. It was so stunning, I couldn't believe my eyes. So at this point, I'm pointing out that either by acts of silence, omission, or commission, we need to understand the long-term impact for particularly Black folks and other people of color. It may not matter to most of you. It matters to me, and it matters to the people I represent. I am neither hopeful nor am I optimistic that it will change anything, but I will not be silent ever, ever in situations where racism and marginalization is perpetuated in this district. That doesn't mean I expect anybody to do anything about it, but I'm not gonna be silent. That is my purpose. I will state it again. I'm neither hopeful nor optimistic that this important historical fact will actually change anything in this process.
Student Director Cronborough.
Thank you, and thank you, Director Sarju, for that. So first of all, to the question of where can we find these maps, because Mr. Narver, I think you said something along the lines of like it was hard to find or you hadn't seen them. In about like the 30 seconds when that conversation was going on, I opened up my computer. I went to this fantastic, fabulous place called Google, and I looked up Seattle redlining map. And the first image result that you'll find is from the University of Washington. And it shows a map of historical redlining. And secondly, to paint a little picture of when we talk about history, when we talk about historical racism, you might remember earlier this evening we had a conversation and we listened to a story about intergenerational trauma. When we talk about intergenerational trauma, we see how one event in Generation A can still have massive effects on the health and well-being of a person in Generation Z, right? When we talk about history, and specifically when we talk about the history of this city, the infrastructure of this city, and how it is rooted in racism, when you chop down a tree, the roots don't go away. Those roots are still there. This infrastructure, Generation A, which is this redlining map, is still there. It just goes by a different name. We chopped it off, and I just think it's frankly ridiculous that, and like offensive to me, and I'm not a Black person. I'm not an African American person in this space. And even I can recognize that, hey, this is an important historical fact and an important historical event that still has really, really great and really visible effects on our city today. And to blatantly ignore it is quite frankly ridiculous and offensive to me. Furthermore, I think to the question of like what correlation does this have? when it comes to respecting historical facts. I think that, to me, redlining here in Seattle is not just a thing of history. Redlining here in Seattle, going by a different name of like, you could even say not in this terms of redistricting, because, you know, in this terms of redistricting, we are just talking about that one thing, as you said. It's all about just like who you vote for in the primaries. When we work on redistricting our city, when like the whole idea of districting our city was this redlining map, it just doesn't make any sense to me how that wouldn't even be considered. I mean, I understand that the initial thought is, well, it has no effect. Effects can be tricky to root out and hide. Like, if you see a tree that's been chopped down to the root and the roots are still in the ground, you're gonna have to dig for it. And that's important work to be done. So I just wanna say thank you, Director Sarju, and yeah, you frankly need to be digging out those roots. And I don't really mind if I'm seen as ridiculous for this, but the roots of racism in our city are real and are showing up today in the way that a Black woman who sits on our school board was kind of immediately shut down and silenced when she brought up an important historical fact. And I just want everybody to sit with that for a moment. Thank you.
All right. I believe that there is more in this particular presentation. Am I correct, or has this concluded? Ms. Redmond, by all means.
Good evening to the board and to our community. Want to just draw attention to the communications portion of this particular plan. Certainly the state, and we've already gone over it, has a prescriptive framework for how to publish, how to go about gathering public comment, but I do want to add where public affairs has come alongside to help support, and to know that we have lifted up a web hub, which is attached to our website, and when you're on the school board members page, you can go directly there. We can also harvest that direct link and then share it. And the way that we have shared would be to go through some traditional means and then some unconventional means. One would be a flat email that goes out through our school messenger system that went to staff as well as to our families. The other would be our school beat newsletter. So that is also circulated amongst staff, again, and also our families. We also have our website, so traditional means there, but we've also shared with our local media. We have released press releases, and I would say we've done so with some pretty good success. We have had it picked up several times, and I think one of the results that you can see is through our Let's Talk infrastructure, that we have received over 120 comments thus far, and I fully expect that there will be more just tonight. I also want to give a shout out to not only mainstream media, but our community-based media. When we're talking about where people live, how they get their news, whether it be blog, whether it be through the Medium, various other grassroots community systems, we put that information out and they were so gracious to run it. So we've heard it not only on mainstream media, but also in those community spaces. So we appreciate that partnership and lifting that up. So those are the traditional means. And of course, we are going to be hearing from some public comment tonight as well as at the end of October. So those are the means in which we've been able to support, and looking forward to hearing those comments, reading those comments, and making sure that Flo gets that information. Any questions?
Hi, Beverly. Thank you for all this. And I'm glad to see these websites up and the Let's Talk. I really look forward to receiving all of the information that's brought in there. And this is maybe an unnecessary critique. I look at the redistricting webpage and it's a lot of words. And I know Flo had like a little graphic of the timeline. I think you know, something that maybe people can look at first glance and kind of get that picture without reading, a lot of reading here.
Sure.
Because, you know, people don't always have time to do all the reading. So if we can incorporate any kind of something a little more graphic and interactive, that might just to reach people a little better. And I'm assuming this page is translated?
Yes,
Okay.
indeed. I will speak to your suggestion, which is a good one, necessarily going to graphics, but one of the pieces that the public affairs team is lifting up is a video on how to get to the information, how to use that information, just another way that we can reach the community. And as you mentioned, not everyone is reading. We're a generation of scanners now, and also at various reading levels. So we want to make sure that we're reaching as many people as possible.
Thank you. And is the redistricting draft plan itself translated?
The draft plan, I would have to check, but I don't believe so, but we can go back and look at it.
Yeah, we need to do that if it's not, you know, because, yeah. I know you understand. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Yes.
So one thing that I have heard from community is actually about the quality and, excuse me, sorry, it's trying to adjust this at the same time. Does somebody else have a microphone on? Okay. All right. So one of the things that I have consistently heard from community is about the resolution of the maps. When you zoom in to try to like identify where the actual boundaries in the streets are, it gets really blurry. So I'm wondering if we could get a higher resolution version that is shared. And then on top of that, being able to annotate, if this is possible, the boundaries that are cut, if we could get those annotated with like on those boundary lines, what is that street name? That would be super helpful for community as well to be able to determine where exactly do those boundaries lie. So higher resolution and an actual street name for the cut would be super helpful as folks are like pinching in most of the time on a cell phone to see exactly where those boundaries are.
Thank you for that.
Director Harris.
Thank you, Assistant Superintendent Redmond. Much appreciate the feedback. Will we get a printout of the computer program that folks type into?
Let's Talk.
Let's Talk. I think we've had it for 5 years. I've asked many, many times prior to your time for the printouts of that, and I believe that all I've ever heard is crickets. Has anybody else on the board ever gotten a printout?
You want a physical copy?
I want it on the email
It's there.
that shows me.
It's there.
Is it there?
Literally there. It's attached to the document that we're saying, the information.
Okay, and is that then been sent to us, and/or has it been made clear that it's there? Because I try real hard to keep up. I don't mean to feel stupid here.
No, that's okay. We'll clarify.
Anyway, if you could highlight that, ever so appreciative. Thank you.
President Hersey, Ellie Wilson-Jones, Director of Policy and Board Relations. I can get to both those technical questions that you both just raised real quickly.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Then if there's additional and follow-up, if this isn't responsive, just let me know. But first, on our redistricting page, there is a link to the scenario viewer that Gavin was demonstrating today. And in that tool, you can drill down all the way to the street names. It kind of requires that interactivity in order to get to that detail. There's also an option kind of at the top right of the screen for you to search by address if you wanted to see where you would show up in the map, and then you can filter for different levels of information on the map. So that is probably the best resource. We have that on the redistricting webpage. It's the online scenario viewer. And then to Director Harris's question about Let's Talk, we're using it. We've developed a landing page, and you kind of have two choices right now when you get to that landing page through the redistricting website. One is to send in questions, and we have been responding to those in the board office. They're for process questions. So I'm having trouble with this link. We respond with the link. What's the supporting analysis for this map? We refer to the right documents in the bar packet to make sure people have that. The other one is to submit feedback, and that's getting directly inputted into the form that was emailed to you today. So you have all of the feedback content.
Did that fully answer your question? Both of you.
I have a request for flow. I'm in the various scenarios. It has the CVAP by race and ethnicity per district. Could you add a line that shows what the overall racial breakdown is for the entire city, so we can do the relative comparisons and kind of gauge if there is any voter dilution happening?
So just to clarify, would you like that for each of the city districts, or just the total breakdown for the city?
Our current board packet has it by it has it broken down for each of the districts, for each of the 3 scenarios. And my request is just to add a overall total city, what is that demographic background, so we can compare it, each district relative to the city overall.
Okay, well, we can look for that and see what we can do there.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Director Hampson.
Okay, bear with me. I'm going to try to make some connections, and it is communications related, Bev, I swear. So I just want to address we did actually talk about redlining specifically in committee. One of my topics that's near and dear to my heart as a former banker who specifically went into banking to combat the negative impacts of redlining. So, which is the industry that created redlining, and the home mortgage industry throughout this country, particularly in Chicago. I could start a whole history lesson, but I'm not gonna do that, except that it is a piece of education that's really important. And I think that's what I'm hearing from my fellow directors. And so while we did bring it up and said, you know, there's no opportunity for us within this process to combat the impacts of redlining in terms of how we redraw our boundaries, I think maybe what we're missing is a level of acknowledgement at the impact of redlining. And I say redlining, it was a very specific racist tactic used to make sure that particularly Black Americans did not get access to home loans, even when they had the money to make that work. All kinds of horrible tactics to even take advantage of them, making them believe that they could get a loan when they couldn't. So there's also a whole other series of layers. So it's actually, you can Google it, but the maps are not, it's maps, plural, right? Because there are also covenants that were and have remained part of the city until very recently, especially if it's a neighborhood association, people have to get together and actually vote to take those things out. So my question is, I don't see, and I haven't heard anything that says, is there something that we need to do to make sure that we are not perpetuating this, when in fact actually we're also in this process of trying to maintain communities. And they came from, it was really like a racist economic practices, which are still very prevalent today. And so in terms of the outcome that we seek, my question is it about making sure that we talk about that it's traumatic to look at this map and actually be able to visualize, we still have districts in terms of when we draw these populations or these maps and that are connected to voter precincts as well, that remind us of how segregated our city is and how much the historic practices have played into how we even vote today. And we also had conversations in committee. Another reason why we should be having these conversations as a whole board and not in committee, because we lose some really important pieces that we did talk about and that well, I lost the thread there. But so that's my question is, it is a really good opportunity to remind our community that what the city is built on. Because by the way, the first people that were outlawed from the city of Seattle were Native people who were, yeah. And the school district was created in that same period. So we're part of that history, right? And so that's kind of my question back to directors is maybe it's part of the communication that we link up to a reputable source that talks about the impacts. And that was one of the reasons I brought up the recommissioning, the redistricting commission, because it's an outside entity that's trying to take into consideration some of those things. And I can't tell all that went into that, but it feels like a more 360 review of the history of all those practices. I don't know if that helps, but that's my attempt, Director Sarju.
So the reason why I brought it up, I'm going to be real clear. I wasn't seeking a change. There is no possibility for change at this point. If we are truly walking the walk of anti-racism, this is where you would have started, period. In the future, now that you know better, do better. In this type of work, it is important to understand the historical context of how things came to be in an effort to not perpetuate those racist practices and outcomes and experiences and just fill in the blank. I have no delusion, and I'm using the word delusion. I'm not deluded that my comments or my bringing up this topic is going to change anything. The train left the station a long time ago. But if we're going to walk the talk of anti-racism and doing better, particularly for Black boys, the conversation has to start at the beginning, not an afterthought. I hope that going forward, that it's not an afterthought, that I don't have to ask the question, did you? That it will be apparent. So I'm letting this go. There is no opportunity for change at this point. I don't expect it. But what I do expect in the future is that these types of considerations are the first, and not because a board member has brought it up and then a student board member says in 30 seconds, you can find it on Google.
Okay, I've got one just last crystallization before we move on from this topic, and I think that this highlights something that this board particularly, and other boards throughout Seattle, whether it be the school board, city council, X, Y, and Z. So everything that everybody has said up here in some way, shape, or form is correct. What I want to challenge us to do is to make the link between the frustration for not starting in this process to the structural decision that exists at the other end. Because there is a danger, in my opinion, when we have these types of conversations up here as a group, and then we start to bring in language around like, this board member was, potentially silenced, or like when we start thinking about how do we incorporate, these maps into, or when I say these maps, redlining maps, into a situation or into a process that, quite frankly, is focused around voting districts and things like that. The issue there is that unless we are adequately prepared to have that conversation really clearly, folks who are going to watch this tape back, I can guarantee you, are going to be very confused. And I think that it diminishes our ability to be experts on anti-racist policy and how we incorporate that into the work that we do, unless we get really, 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 really good at having those conversations. And so this is an opportunity, because it's not just on Flow Analytics, right? This is on us as a board too, because when we have these conversations in a public forum, for example, that are going to live on in various means of media, I want to be able to sleep at night knowing that the community is better for that conversation, right? And unless we do a really, really good job of explaining what our points are, which is why I asked back to Director Harris and Director Sarju, help me understand what it is you are advocating for in this particular instance. And we eventually got there, but had we been, I believe, more prepared in how we want to have those conversations, what our points are being made, and sometimes it's going to be an instance where something pops into our head and we want to share it and whatnot. But as a Black man looking and listening to this conversation, I, as an individual, as president of this board, am very confused about where folks stand and what the real issue is. And very technically, we have big problems within these maps that community have communicated to us that we can communicate back to Flow, right? Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the structural issues are addressed. I 100% concur with Director Sarju that there are opportunities in this for not only education, but to also ensure that we are not perpetuating already very broken systems. At the same time, unless we are effective and credible messengers to that, those advocacy points will fall on deaf ears, which makes us less effective elected officials in our jobs. So what I am asking as an individual, as president of the board, when we position ourselves to have these conversations, let's take a minute, make sure that we're making the link between what we are sharing as a historical trauma that has really impeded upon Native folks and Black folks in this city, and what the board actually has the power to do about it, and where those opportunities for process might lie, and be really honest that it's probably not this particular instance, right? Because we can have this conversation up here and go back and forth, but like Michelle said, at the end of the day, it's effectively not going to change anything because these two instances are very loosely linked when there could very well be an opportunity for us to have real advocacy to the districts and bodies that actually have power over what redlining looks like, right? So that's my only concern. I want to make sure that everybody is super clear on what it is that they are advocating for so that we can be effective and credible messengers to the folks that put us in these seats. So with that being said, I would like to move on to the next introduction item unless there is anything else that we have on this particular piece. Okay, thank you. Robust discussion, looking forward to continuing it. Thank you very much to our partners at Flow, General Counsel Narver, and Assistant Superintendent Redmond.
And
oh, we do have public comment, I'm sorry. Please, by all means. Ms. Wilson-Jones, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, for today's public hearing, this is going to be regarding the draft redistricting plan that the board has had introduced and that comments have been focusing so far today. We had public testimony signups for those wishing to speak remotely online, and we did not have any signups for that portion, but we do have one sign up for in person. If there's anybody additional in the room that wishes to add your name to the list, come find me. But with no further ado, we'll move into public testimony from Chris Jackins, and there's a 2-minute speaking time for today's public hearing.
Nice to see you again tonight. My name is Chris Jackins, Box 84063, Seattle 98124. On the draft School Board Director District Redistricting Plans, 8 points. Number 1, each of 3 scenarios narrows the population difference between director districts. Number 2, the board is recommending scenario number 1. Is this because scenario number 1 has the smallest population gaps between director districts? Number 3, for each scenario, the report does not provide a complete printed list of census blocks and precincts with population counts. Number 4, is any school attendance area split between director districts. Number 5, at my request, a court reviewed the 2012 board redistricting. The size gap between districts was 10.6%. This means that for the last 10 years, the votes of Director District Number 7 residents have counted 10% more than those of Director District Number 4. Number 6, each new scenario splits some precincts. It is more difficult for voters in split precincts to know who their board director is. Number 7, do the new scenarios include the district precincts which lie outside the city of Seattle? Number 8, the entire district population for each new scenario is 737,763. However, the consultant's report lists a different value of 737,255 for the current director districts. The numbers should match, but they do not match. See pages 4 and 6, which I have included in my written statement to you. Thank you very much.
Geez, that was the only testimony for tonight.
All good. Okay, we have received public testimony. Thank you, Mr. Jackins. We greatly appreciate it. Are we now prepared to move on to the rest of today's introduction items? Do you have everything you need from us at this point, General Counsel Narv?
You ready for number 2? My only role on introduction item number 2 will be I'm delighted to turn the podium over to Melinda Goodleaf, who is the Director of Records and Archives, to present this item.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about this proposal. I am the manager of Records and Archives, but I would love the promotion, so apparently it's in the works. I hope to make this quick. The Records and Archives Center is a 7,000 square foot facility on the north end of the 2nd floor. If you have not visited, I highly recommend visiting. I love giving tours, so definitely stop by. And we are proposing to rename the facility. So right now it's just called the Records and Archives Center or the Archives and Records Management Center, and we would like to name it after Eleanor Toews, who is the first district archivist. She worked for the district for over 30 years. She retired in 2011, and she still volunteers in the archives. She's still on the scholarship committee for the scholarship fund. We'll just leave it there. And she's on the Building for Learning book. So we are in the process of rewriting that book, and she is on that committee. So she's very involved in the district, very involved in the archival community. And I think it would be a great honor, and we're just so happy to offer this to her, to rename our facility after her. It really would not exist without her. So I hope you consider it.
Any questions from directors?
Go ahead.
Oh, I would love a tour.
Yeah, no, definitely stop by.
Okay, can I just drop in, or should I email you, or?
Emailing's probably better, but you can drop by Monday through Friday, usually between 7 and 3:30.
Okay, and then also, if you haven't seen it, the SPS Archives has an awesome Instagram feed. It's like one of my favorite Instagrams with pictures of historical buildings and students, and it's very, very cool. So just plugging that.
Thank you, Director Rankin. Director Harris.
It's been my privilege for the last 7 years to serve on the scholarship committee with Eleanor, and she's just the best of the best. And I think I've mentioned a few times recently about how it feels sometimes like we're losing our soul here. Eleanor is the embodiment of soul. And recognizing that kind of excellence and dedication is absolutely, and I did send the bar out to the scholarship committee as soon as it was printed, and they are more than unanimous and really excited about this. Thank you.
That's great to hear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We appreciate it.
Okay, thanks.
All right, we will now be moving to number 3, approval of revised board policy number 4218, speakers of diverse languages, in renaming policy language access. I see Dr. Torres is approaching the podium, so I will wait. And then just for clarification, we will be going to Director Rankin first for questions.
Quisiera tomar un momentito para darle las gracias a directora Luna Cron-Barón por reconocer que hoy estamos en el mes de herencia hispana y latinx, y también por sus comentarios acerca de la raza nativa, específicamente porque como una persona que lleva sangre taína dentro de mí mismo es algo que yo aprecio. And so I'll do it in English for everybody. I just want to take a quick Assistant Superintendent moment to say thank you to Director Luna Cron-Barón for her comments earlier, particularly around Latinx Heritage Month, and also for her comments around Native heritage. As someone of Native Taino descent, I am very proud and happy for her comments today as one of our students. So I wanted to take that moment and privilege. Now to the work at hand. Good evening. I'm here this evening to present the Board Action Report for the revision of Board Policy number 4218, Speakers of Diverse Languages. Additionally, Michelle Oda, Director of Multilingual and International Programs, is available virtually to assist with questions. This action report concerns a policy that ensures the district provides interpretation and translation services according to our students' and families' civil rights. In 2022, the Washington State Legislature passed House Bill 1153, which created new legal requirements relating to language access in public schools. The new law requires school districts to adopt a language access policy and procedure that adheres to the principles of an effective language access program and incorporates the model policy and procedures adopted by the Washington State School Directors Association, also known as WSSDA. House Bill 1153 was the outcome of statewide language access work group created by the legislature in 2019 and reconvened in 2021. The Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction and the Office of Education Ombuds convened this work group for the purpose of advising OSPI, WSSDA, and the legislature on specific strategies meant to improve meaningful, equitable access for public school students and their family members who have language access barriers. The specific proposed revisions to Board Policy number 4218 are as follows. 1, title. A change to the title of policy from Speakers of Diverse Languages to Language Access to provide clarity on the purpose of the policy. 4 principles of an effective language access policy. The amended policy includes the 4 principles of the Effective Access Language Program. Board review. The board will periodically review pertinent data collected according to the accompanying procedure and review spending on language access services as part of the annual budget process. The amended policy deletes sections on parent-guardian identification, interpretation, translation, and staff guidance, and moves those sections to Superintendent Procedure number 4218 SP, which will be amended this fall. It should also be noted that the district collects parent-family spoken correspondence languages, provides in-house translation and interpretation in the district's top 5 languages other than English, ASL, which is American Sign Language, interpreters upon request, access to over-the-phone interpretation in over 350 languages, and other tools accessible to staff and families. Thank you for your time, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you. As a reminder, refresher for my fellow board members and committee members, this was the board action report that would have come through committee last week, but it wasn't quite done routing. But we did have, just as a reminder, we did have it as a special attention item, as a sort of preview in August. So this is hopefully a surprise to no one. As Dr. Torres said, this is a policy that we already had, but given the passage of the law at the state level, we're required by WASDA to update to align the language. And I'll just say it's thank you to Dr. Torres and Language Access staff for the opportunity to connect on separating policy from procedure and to give some feedback on that. I appreciated that, and I think it's much more clear about what the aim of this is. And my only question is about, well, maybe it'll be, you know what, I'm going to wait because you said the procedures are being updated too.
Yes.
Okay, so my question actually has to do with that, so I'll just wait till we do that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, President Hersey. 3 questions. Two questions, 1 comment. Thanks very much to Director Oda as well. Recognizing her hard work over the years is critical, I think. 2, when the fine folks in the legislature passed this House bill, did they give us any additional money, or is this yet another unfunded mandate?
To my understanding, it was no funding that accompanied the legislation, but I can follow up for that if you would like confirmation.
I very much would like that. And last, my question is, with respect to the superintendent procedures, will those be done when we are supposed to vote on this in 2 weeks? Devil's in the details.
Director Oda is available virtually. If you can unmute and address the question. If not, what I would be able to do is meet with Director Oda, and then we can get that response to you all as a board via email.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Director Torres. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, thank you.
So thanks. Thank you for allowing me to attend virtually. The question around the funding, there was no funding attached to this legislation. And then the second question is, we are working hard and hopefully we'll get the procedures done to you on time. That has been our goal.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Of course. We will now be moving on to introduction item number 4.
Good evening, Fred Podesta, Assistant Superintendent of Operations. If the board will allow it, I have 3 actions that are nearly identical. So I'm going to describe them in general terms, and then they accomplish virtually the same thing for 3 different construction projects. And I'll describe how they work, and then we can talk about those projects specifically. What they do is approve an alternative public works process, which will allows us to use the general contractor construction management form of a public works project as opposed to the traditional design bid build. This allows us to engage a general contractor and construction manager at the beginning of the project to help us manage the project while it's still in design. To utilize this form of construction delivery, we need approval from the state. The state has approved that for all 3 projects. And we need to have the board adopt a resolution affirming our use of this process. These actions also award contracts to the respective general contractors and construction managers, and they all each include a budget addition and a transfer from reserves that we have in the BEX 5 funding, all from underspend on previous projects. The reason for the increase in budget in all these projects is escalating construction costs. When the district planned the BEX 5 levy, that we had what's known as escalation built into those project estimates of 4%. I think you've all seen over the last year that inflation is running much higher than 4%, and these bids have come in higher than we originally planned for. Fortunately, in the earlier part of the levy program, there were savings that we can draw on to fund these budget increases for these 3 projects. It's worth noting that these are the last large construction projects in the BEX 5 levy, so we're still expecting to land within our budgeted expenses between this and our program contingency. We still have other projects to do, but they're relatively small in nature, so I don't think this is a general concern. And again, the 3 projects in question are the replacement of Alki Elementary and awarding a contract to Cornerstone The scope of that project is to demolish the main part of the existing building and build up with all new construction. The second project is again similar. It does all the same things that I just described. It approves GCCM project delivery and awards a contract to Leidig for John Rogers Elementary School. Again, demolishing most of the building and replacing with all new construction. And then the third in this series is the same set of steps for Montlake Elementary modernization and addition. It approves the alternate public works process and awards a contract to Sca, and then again augments the budget with a budget transfer from savings on earlier projects. So I hope that's okay that I bundle those together, try to save a little time, and I would be happy to take any questions about any of the three.
Get this audio system figured out. Any questions from directors on those three items? Director Rivera-Smith, take it away.
Thank you. And thank you for your summary of those three projects. They're all very similar. We went through them in Operations Committee. And I will draw just briefly attention to Mr. Jackins gave us a summary of some questions regarding these projects. I don't know if you had a chance to look at that. But if you could, look, I won't go through all of them right now because it's kind of a long list. But you just let us know, perhaps, when you bring this back, or maybe we can talk offline.
Sure, I heard the verbal testimony. If the board has received a written document, I don't have it. But.
Oh, I can get that to you then. Yeah, just to check and see if there's anything on there that we should be more aware of or considering. You know, some of the things like we're increasing the size and not increasing the parking, and I know that's sort of the way the city is going, though, with hoping to be able to use more public transportation, and clearly trying to make use of a small space, especially for Alki. So I don't know if that's, to me, a deal breaker at all, but I think that some other questions regarding cultural resources that are at risk, and it's like I said, it's kind of long here, but just wanted to make sure that these things are community concerns are. I know there's a lot of planning into this, and we obviously had the SSTAT, and these things have been through the process. Just wanted to, before we I don't want to discount anyone's concerns. So if there's anything there to talk about, let's do that maybe offline. Otherwise, these are all moved forward for approval out of committee, and just as he presented. Thank you.
Any other questions from directors? Okay, seeing none. Help me if I miscounted, but we still need to do number 8. Yeah.
We still have two more items. I had 5 altogether. We got 3 done, so we're at intro item 7, which is the approval of the site-specific educational specifications for the Mercer Middle School replacement project. So, educational specifications are a narrative document that describes space planning for our school buildings, and for each type of school, elementary, middle schools, and high schools, there's a baseline district ed specification, which is then tailored for each project. It's required that the board, there's state funding in this project, it's required that the board approve our site-specific specification for the Mercer replacement. The changes from the baseline are relatively modest. There's reconfiguration of a couple learning spaces, and then the rest is mostly about operational spaces. Excellent. I'm glad I put everyone to sleep. And so this action approves our refinement of the spec for Mercer, and gives us approval to move forward, which again is needed for state funding. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have.
Any questions?
This also was moved forward for approval out of committee. I'm trying to recall if we had any big questions about it, and Director Somworth maybe can remind me. Otherwise, yeah, we appreciate the work that's done to make these specific to our schools. We have a blanket middle school ed specs, but we do. It's great that we're able to
The SSTAT includes school staff and school community. We made, again, some operational changes, how break room works for the custodial team, how some community spaces were set up in the school, because our requirements is that they're within sight lines, and some of these wouldn't have been, so those spaces were reconfigured. But again, overall, fairly modest changes to the baseline.
Thank you.
Let's do it.
Great. And so the last one is a transaction I brought many times to the board. Again, the projects that have state funding, again, Mercer, require us to do an analysis of enrollment at the school and how it might be affected by the project itself. The instructions are very specific about how we do what the state terms racial imbalance, gives us very specific parameters to study enrollment, historic enrollment at the school. We've done the analysis, and this action just adopts a resolution where the board asserts that we've done the analysis and this will not create or exacerbate racial imbalance per those definitions that are in state law. And again, this is required to secure the funding.
Any questions? Thank you, Mr. Podesta.
Thank you.
We are all wide awake because of your reports. Thank
There you go. Thank you. I know, save the best for last.
Hey, absolutely. Yo, give it up for Fred, everybody. He's here, hopefully, all year and many years to come. With that being said, we have now come to the board comments section of tonight's agenda. Who got stuff to say? Anybody? Any takers? Go ahead.
Okay, couple of things. One, Sunday, October 16, 2 to 4:30, Southwest Library Community Meeting, District 6. Southwest Library is on 35th Avenue Southwest and Henderson Street. It is the rebuilt library where I grew up, and the bridge is open. And I owe Dina Morris $30 because I gave her double odds that it wouldn't happen on time. I'm going to give it to her in ones. You probably have a good chance of lasagna, and I would invite at least 2 of my fellow board directors to come, and senior staff and other folks. I told you it was Sunday, October 16, 2 to 4:30. Well, we'll have to report back to you and show you pictures of the lasagna if we have it. Make you jealous. I hesitate to bring this up, but I'm going to go for it anyway. We received significant comments from Mr. Jackins, who provides an important role to this district, that were dated August 29. We did not receive them until today. Because of the work stoppage, our mail got corked. With respect to Alki Elementary, I know that place like the back of my hand. I have roller skated there on Friday nights. I have played on that parks field. And that building is not worthy of our students. And I guess I'm having trouble sometimes, Chris, and you know I care about you and care for you. I want to know what you do support. I really, truly do want to know that from my heart to yours, because all we hear is what you don't like. And we've come a long way on things like field lighting that is not as nasty and obnoxious as it used to be in the old days. You talked tonight about the Madison playground and fields. They're mud pits half the year. Is that good for our students? And thank the goodness that we don't have crumb rubber anymore on our fields. You gotta give us that. That was a good save. And our students can continue to play all year long. And athletics and outdoor recreation have to be important to us. I don't get it. It's always negative. And I'm not quite sure I understand why a school rebuild and noise is somehow different than all the construction going on in this city. And moreover, the neighbors' their assessments are going to go up with a really lovely building, not one that is not suited for education. And the fact that we share with the Seattle Parks Department, we just talked about that 2 weeks ago. That's a good thing. But I want to get a letter like this sometime about what we're doing right. Truly, I would. Appreciate it immensely. Thank you.
Thanks, Director Harris. Director Sarju.
So first, to my new board member, Director Luna, I just want to declare that you don't just get 1 month. Every month is Black History Month. Every month is Latinx History Month. We cannot buy into that nonsense. If I had known we were going to talk about this tonight, I would have worn my t-shirt, because I have a t-shirt that says every month is Black History Month, and I don't play. So what you saw tonight, Director Hersey, was I don't play. In the early 2000s, which you were likely in elementary school or middle school, I had a conversation with Director Mary Bass about a specific area, and we will have an off-the-line conversation. So tonight, I just want to state, and one of my constituents, who is an ally, texted me and said she fully understood my point. And my point was not that I thought we were going to bring about change, but we have to do better from the very beginning. We need to model for our children that matters of racism, marginalization, whether it's of Black and brown people or special ed kids, is not a second thought, it's the first thought. So this process was already in motion. I don't expect a change, because we didn't do what we needed to do from the very beginning. That was solely my point. I was hopeful that they were going to tell me something different and that I would be wrong. I wanted to be wrong so badly. And I have at least 2 board directors who know that I really did want to be wrong on this. So sometimes somebody has to be brave enough and step out of the common pretending that these things don't matter, because they do. And they will matter for generations to come. Not necessarily that my comments were going to bring about change, but I can't be silent. I cannot be silent. And so if I confused people, I will directly apologize on tape. But this is going to be what you see me do for the next 3 years and 3 months. Is I will call out things that are not okay, not necessarily expecting a change. Because if I don't do it, silence is complicity every single time. When those students came up and spoke about sexual assault and harassment, they were not silent, and we should not be either. The same goes for this. So again, I do apologize if I confused anybody, but there was a purpose to my madness. It was a righteous anger, and I'm still angry. I'm still angry. Nothing's going to change, but I can still be angry. I will get over it because I have to. But again, I just want to commend my board director, Director Luna Kron-Baron. Okay, I have a little tiny bit of accent. People used to tell me it was good, but I've lost it. I appreciate your comments tonight, and I am really looking forward to working with you on your tenure on this board.
Thank you, Director Sarju. Any other comments? Go ahead, Director Rankin.
It's the quickest of quick. Just Shana Tova, Happy New Year.
I'll believe it when I see it.
Shana Tova, Happy New Year to my fellow Jews.
Yo.
And there's no meeting scheduled next week on Wednesday or work session because it is Yom Kippur, which is the most important holiday in the Jewish calendar. So you may notice that you have students or educators who are not in school that day, and that is because it is the Day of Atonement, where we consider things we may have done to wrong others in the past and commit to doing better in the future. And then folks break their fast together after sundown. So that is why there's nothing on the calendar next week, and thank you for that. And that's all.
I am thoroughly impressed. Good
Got
job. Yes, consider me gotten. Any other comments before we close out tonight? All right, thank you very much. There being no business before the board, this meeting stands adjourned at 8:11. Appreciate it.